Chapter 2302. This figure was a young man in his 20s. However, he was only able to see his age. His true appearance was indistinct, as though there was a layer of fog covering his face. The effect of this kind of concealment was quite strong. Even Luo Fan could not see through the fog and see his real face. This alone was enough to show that this person was much stronger than Luo Fan in some aspects. Not to mention the fact that he had appeared here in such a manner and was directly facing Luo Fan. This showed how extraordinary he was, and it was difficult for others to ignore him any more. "You've gone too far," the man said at this time. With these words, Luo Fan felt an indescribable sense of crisis emerging from the depths of his heart. It was as if at this moment, he had turned from a powerful expert of the 5 tribulations to a naked baby in the snow. This feeling of helplessness made him unable to help summoning the light of heaven and earth. His body began to emit a light that was like a living thing. With this light, the incomparably strong sense of crisis weakened a little. Although it still existed, at least it was not to the extent of making him appear on the snow as a naked baby. In the face of such a change, the man who appeared in front of him looked indifferent. He just quietly stared at him. The pair of originally blurred eyes suddenly became clear. In those eyes there seemed to be infinite heaven and earth, infinite universe, and infinite power. An indescribable suction appeared in those eyes, faintly penetrating all the defenses on Luo Fan's body, penetrating his body, penetrating his soul, and reaching the root of his soul, reaching straight to the core of his soul. "I didn't expect that I would be treated like this." At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. This method of completely bypassing all the strength and appearance of the opponent and directly targeting the core of the opponent's soul was originally his best method. In fact, the method he used to deal with all the other practitioners on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path was actually similar. But now, this young man before him had actually used this technique on him, and it actually made him feel as if he was unable to defend against it. How could he not feel inexplicably emotional? Of course, while he was feeling emotional, he had no intention of surrendering. One had to know that with his methods of toying with the minds of other cultivators, if the core of his mind really fell into the hands of others, then what awaited him would be a dark abyss with no way out. At that time, the freedom of one's will and life would no longer be under one's control. How could he accept such a fate? At that moment, he let out a roar as a mysterious light began to shine from the depths of his heart. This light was bright and dazzling, containing an unimaginable independent aura, as if it was different from any other world. This was the aura of the world of laws. It was an independent aura that completely belonged to Luo Fan. It was different from any world view that was popular in any world view. This absolutely independent aura had an absolute exclusivity. At this moment, his heart had already obtained this exclusivity, so that any foreign object that approached his heart would be under pressure that it did not have before. It was like the kind of suction that came from the eyes of the young man in front of him and directly targeted the core of the soul. Under the effect of this exclusion, it began to retreat little by little, and finally withdrew from Luo Fan's mind, making him feel lighter both physically and mentally. The feeling that his mind was about to lose its autonomy in the next moment, and the feeling of losing its ability to move had completely disappeared. At this time, there was a look of surprise in the young man's eyes as he said, "So you chose the opposite path, no wonder you are so unsociable. Who are you?" Luo Fan stared at the young man in front of him with extreme vigilance. He could feel that the young man in front of him was not a physical existence. In other words, it was not a cultivator's real body, doppelganger, incarnation, or even a projection. It was an extremely strange and mysterious existence, one that even he did not understand at this moment. This kind of existence was between reality and illusion. It seemed to exist and not exist at the same time. It had the characteristics of a real thing, but also the characteristics of an illusory thing that did not exist. This characteristic allowed him to exert some of the power that a physical body could exert here, and also allowed him to avoid the punishment of things that should not appear here. From this strange characteristic, it could already be known that the existence in front of him must have come from a higher level of the Tao Master Path. Moreover, it was definitely not the Tao Master Path of the 5th or 6th level, which was very close to the 4th level, but possibly the projection of the Tao Master Path of the 7th level or even higher. This situation at this time made Luo Fan's heart involuntarily have some kind of ominous premonition at this time. The barrier that existed in the entire 4th level, which divided the entire 4th level into the domain of the Tao Master and the domain of the rogue cultivators, seemed to have been set up by a very high-level cultivator. Could it be that the cultivator in front of him was the disciple of the Tao Master who had set up the barrier on the 4th level? My name can't be said here. However, I think you should be able to roughly guess. Yes, it is as you guessed, the young man said indifferently. Hearing this, Luo Fan was shocked. He did not think that there would be any misunderstanding between him and this expert, nor did he think that the speculation in his heart at this time would be different from the speculation in the heart of the expert in front of him. After all, at their level, language was no longer the only way to communicate with each other, therefore, it was obvious that the cultivator in front of him must be the cultivator who had set up the barrier on the 4th level to divide it. It really is you. Luo Fan sighed. I originally thought that you would either never appear, or you would appear as soon as I broke the barrier. I didn't expect you to actually appear here at this time. At this time, there were 2 layers of light on his body. One was hidden in the inner layer, which contained the incompatibility with everything else in the outside world, as if he was a perfect, independent, and unique individual. The other layer of light was in the outer layer, which was like a living thing. The inner layer of light was triggered from the world view of laws, and it belonged to the world view of laws. The outer layer of light was the light of heaven and earth light. These 2 kinds of light were different. The outer layer of heaven and earth light contained infinite power, and it could even put up a fight against existences on the 6th level. Its destructive power and creativity had reached the level of the real world. The inner layer of light, on the other hand, was absolutely perfect. If anything different from this layer of light tried to invade it, it would trigger an intense reaction from the inner layer of light, causing the power of all concept ability contained in his world view of laws to pour in. Under normal circumstances, either of these 2 layers of light would be enough to guard against all possible troubles. However, at this time, even with the protection of these 2 layers of light, Luo Fan still did not feel much sense of security. He had an inexplicable feeling that if this powerhouse in front of him really wanted to deal with him, these 2 layers of light would probably not be of much use. Therefore, at this time, behind these 2 layers of light, he was constantly preparing another method. It was something that he had yet to see from any other cultivator. It was the ability to communicate with existences on various levels that corresponded to him. The young cultivator in front of him looked at Luo Fan with a strange feeling in his heart. He clearly felt that the bit of power he projected into this level should be able to easily deal with the other party, but there was always a sense of uneasiness in his heart, as if it was warning him. It was because of this strange vigilance that he did not directly attack Luo Fan at this time. After all, he had projected this bit of power to the 4th level, and he had other tasks to do. Dealing with Luo Fan was just something that he could do in passing. If he could easily get rid of Luo Fan without any losses, then he would naturally not be polite. However, if dealing with Luo Fan could affect his mission, or even cause him to fail his mission, then that was something he could not accept. After weighing for a while, the young man finally sighed and said, "Forget it, although I don't know what trump card you have, I can't take the risk now. Let's forget about it." Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned, and felt a wave of displeasure in his heart. He just quietly looked at the young man. In order to avoid being invaded again, you must hand over the authority of the ruler. This level also needs to be divided into the territories of the Tao Master's disciples and the independent cultivators. Do you have any objections? The young man said to Luo Fan. When Luo Fan heard this, he only sneered and said, "Don't try to trick me like I'm a fool. I've heard a little about what the war agreement is. I don't know any of the rules that require the ruler of each level to be a disciple of the Tao Master to ensure peace. Dividing this level into the territory of the Tao Master's disciples and the independent cultivators is even more ridiculous. That's just a pretext for the Tao Master's disciples to control the entire path of the Tao Master." "So, you're against it?" At this time, the young man looked at Luo Fan and frowned. There seemed to be a surging mania in the depths of his eyes. "Well said." At this time, a voice came into Luo Fan's ears. Along with this voice, a strange shadow fell from the sky and brazenly fell on the young man in front of him. Although the illusory figure was strange, it clearly did not exceed the young man's reaction range. At this moment, facing such a sudden illusory figure, his body slightly retreated. In a way that even Luo Fan could not sense, he had already retreated several feet, directly dodging the illusory figure that descended from the sky. Exquisite. At this moment, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The retreat of the young man just now seemed ordinary, but in fact it contained infinite mystery. When it happened, Luo Fan did not have any reaction. He only felt that the figure of the young man seemed to transcend time and space, and when the shadow appeared, the figure had already retreated several feet. However, after the matter was over, every detail of the young man's dodging and every trace of profoundness was replayed in his mind. Although it was just a small movement, in his memory, Luo Fan seemed to be facing infinite heaven and earth, infinite great ways, infinite ideas, and infinite power. It was as if he was not an ordinary creature that was moving, but an extremely vast, incomparably mysterious heaven and earth. At this time, the shadow also appeared. It was another figure. It also looked like a young man, but compared to the previous young man, he was a few years older, and looked more straightforward. "It's you?" The Tao Master's disciple looked at the new young man and frowned. "Why can't it be me? If you can come down, why can't I?" The straightforward young man laughed and said, "I don't remember you rogue cultivators actually caring so much about the situation of the lower levels." The Tao Master's disciple said with a frown. Although he was obviously unhappy, he still remained calm. "Ha ha! Of course not in the past, but it's different now. We have hope." The straightforward young man laughed and glanced at Luo Fan. The Tao Master's disciple frowned even more, and for the first time, his eyes were mixed with vigilance as he looked at Luo Fan. "Are you going to push him to be the representative of the lower levels? Let him compete with us for the control of the Tao Master's path?" As the Tao Master's disciple said so, his aura began to expand, and an inexplicable momentum began to crush Luo Fan and the straightforward young man who had just appeared. It seemed that if the straightforward young man did not give a good answer, he would directly attack. Hearing this, the straightforward young man laughed and said, "Of course, can't we? You Tao Master's disciples have been complacent for so long, it's our turn to be complacent for a while, isn't it?" At this time, the Tao Master's disciple sneered, "What a pity, I originally planned to keep him." As he spoke, he raised his hand and slapped toward Luo Fan. With this slap, Luo Fan felt as if the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path had fallen into the palm of the opponent, and with the momentum of the opponent's palm, it crushed toward him. Even though the power of the palm had not yet reached him, he had already felt that the light of heaven and earth around him began to crackle, as if some kind of extremely powerful invisible force was crushing the light of heaven and earth, making it difficult for the light of heaven and earth to bear, and it was about to collapse. An indescribable sense of terror surged wildly from the bottom of his heart, and he almost could not help but use various means brought by his corresponding existences on other levels. Chapter 2303. Puff. With a soft sound, the palm that the Tao Sovereign's disciple had sent towards Luo Fan had already disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. Obviously, it had been broken up by the rough young man. As for what mysteries were hidden in that slap, and what kind of method that straightforward young man used to block that slap, it was not something that Luo Fan could know at this moment. "Can you stop it?" The Tao Master's disciple from a higher level sneered and said. Then, his figure flashed and he rushed straight towards Luo Fan. Such a rushing posture was extremely mysterious. In Luo Fan's eyes, his figure seemed to have completely disappeared, leaving no trace, and there was not a trace of fluctuation around, as if he had completely disappeared from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, in contrast to his disappearance, Luo Fan felt an indescribable strong sense of crisis shrouding him. His light of heaven and earth, his world view, and the infinite power in his body all told him that if he did not respond accordingly, what awaited him was death. Puff, 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 puff. The rough young man sneered and disappeared. At the same time as his disappearance, there were countless indescribable strange fluctuations around Luo Fan's body, which were almost as large as the huge vortex he had created. These fluctuations were like some kind of unimaginable power erupting in the depths of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The continuous eruption gave birth to endless world clusters, produced endless destructive power, and even caused deep destruction in the depths of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Small holes, similar to the holes that led straight to the state of chaos when the Tao Master's path was invaded, constantly emerged and quickly closed. At this moment, the infinite power of the Tao Master's prison descended on this level and began to sweep and search the boundless vortex around the world cluster of Luo Fan. However, this method of searching that was supposed to be successful was unable to find its target at all. It was as if there was nothing there. It was only scanning the area again and digging deeper again and again. Is this the battle between the experts of the 7th and 8th level? At this moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribable shock in his heart. He had already known that the Tao Master's disciple and the rough young man were quite extraordinary, but now that he saw their real strength, he was still shocked. After all, this was a level so profound that he couldn't see it or understand it at all. Is there really no way to see through their actions? A kind of unwillingness emerged from the bottom of Luo Fan's heart at this time. For him, who had even comprehended the mysteries of the true saint, this kind of existence that was beyond his understanding was obviously not something he was willing to accept. To him, allowing this kind of thing to continue was a kind of humiliation. At that moment, his mind turned and he began to think of a way to understand the battle between the two of them. At least, he had to see it. First, he thought of his idea on other levels. Although the battle in front of him happened in the real level, according to the mysterious connection between levels, there should be similar changes in all other levels. The only difference was that because of the difference in levels, the same method would inevitably have some changes, big or small, between different levels. Then, they would need to undergo some kind of subtle transformation in order to transform into the various mysteries in the real world. With this idea, Luo Fan's perception began to communicate with his corresponding existences in each level, and with the help of these existences, he began to explore each level. This probing action made him feel helpless. That's because, although there were 2 experts on every level, there were 2 of them. They were also fighting in the same way on that level. However, it was a pity that, similar to the real level, in the many levels, Luo Fan still could not see through their battle, let alone understand the various mysteries revealed in the process of their battle. It was the same on the conceptual level, the karma level, the illusion level. It was the same on all other levels. Although there is no special research, just the improvement of the realm alone has actually reached this level. Indeed, he is worthy of being a powerhouse above the 6th layer. After experiencing it from the beginning to the end, Luo Fan finally couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. At present, the feedback from various levels had already told him that it was obviously impossible to experience the battle between the two of them through other levels. At this moment, Luo Fan could only retract his gaze from other levels and look at the real level in front of him again. His mind turned and countless ideas and possibilities emerged from the depths of his heart. As various methods continued to take shape, he rejected them again and again. Finally, at a certain moment, he had a flash of inspiration. He looked at the deep and unpredictable fourth level of the road of Tao Master and thought to himself, I am still the real master of this fourth level. How could I forget that there is still such a method? As he thought of this, his perception began to gradually change. The general trend of the fourth level of the road of Tao Master that he could not see before began to appear in front of him. Compared to before, the connection between him and these forces was much closer. His control over them had also become much stronger. This situation clearly showed that his identity as a master was more deeply rooted in people's hearts than before. Luo Fan was not surprised by the emergence of this situation. This was because he had already expected this to happen when he used the light of heaven and earth to send the minds of all the cultivators on the fourth level to that side of the world to control their destinies. At this moment, his mind merged with the general situation and began to condense the power of the general situation. Gradually, the originally scattered boundless general situation gathered towards where he was. Gradually, the general situation turned into a brilliance that piled up above his head. This kind of general trend itself was invisible and intangible, and could not even be called an existence. It could only be said to be an abstract manifestation. However, at this time, under Luo Fan's control, these forces turned from illusory to real and became a kind of treasure-like existence that floated above his head, giving him a kind of incomparably sacred feeling that he didn't have before. As this boundless general trend condensed, all the other cultivators on the fourth level felt as if something had suddenly been taken away from them, and the depths of their hearts suddenly became much emptier. On the other hand, Luo Fan felt as if he had suddenly grown many times stronger. From his original size, he had risen to a terrifying state that could fill the heavens and earth. It was not the true growth of his body, but the growth of his own sense of existence. At this moment, the Tao Sovereign's disciple and the rough young man who were fighting were also attracted by this unimaginable sense of existence. The two of them, who were originally fighting smoothly, suddenly paused at this moment. 4 gazes were cast at Luo Fan from all directions, making him feel as if all his secrets had been seen through. Instinctively, the general trend that floated above his head that was like a treasure light trembled slightly, and the gazes were instantly cut off. The feeling of all his secrets being peeped at naturally disappeared without a trace. What an exquisite method! The rough young man's praise was heard. It's just an unorthodox method. The Tao Sovereign's disciple's voice was heard along with the rough young man's. However, this was all the words the two of them said. Next, their battle began again. It was still extremely smooth, and it even felt like the scale was much larger than before. Luo Fan naturally did not care about their evaluation. At this moment, with the help of the general trend, his eyes began to shine brightly. All kinds of things that he could not see through before began to gradually appear in his eyes. The rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple, who were originally difficult to see through, were gradually revealed in his eyes. Boom! At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if there were billions of thunderbolts exploding in his heart out of nowhere. His entire mind was shaken to the point that it went blank. It was because the mysteries displayed during the battle between the rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple were too profound. It was to the extent that just by looking at them, Luo Fan had already received endless information and comprehended endless mysteries that he had not comprehended before. After a long while, When Luo Fan struggled to break free from the blank state of mind and recover his complete thinking, he found that the depth of the information was beyond his imagination. They were even more profound, unfathomable, and incomprehensible than what the will of the world inside the light of heaven and earth transmitted from the perspective of the will of heaven and earth. With Luo Fan's current realm and his comprehension ability, although he knew that there must be endless principles and endless mysteries contained within it, he was still unable to comprehend it. However, this was as far as he could go. If he wanted to obtain more, it would be impossible. Even so, at this moment, he had already felt that the arrival of his sixth tribulation had been brought forward by several years. Even though it wasn't much, it still represented that his cultivation had risen a step further. And this also made Luo Fan understand that if he could see through and understand all the mysteries revealed in the battle between the rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple, his cultivation realm would definitely be improved beyond imagination. This is still not enough, then I have to trigger the will of heaven and earth. As he thought of this, the light of heaven and earth that had originally covered his body like a living creature began to slowly retract, turning back into a ball of light that appeared above his head. It stood side by side with the treasure light formed by the great force, making it look like there were two pearls on top of his head. Then, the will of heaven and earth inside the light of heaven and earth began to surge, and wisps of strange fluctuations were shot in all directions, heading towards the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. If it had been an ordinary fluctuation, it would have been helpless against the attacks that had penetrated into the deepest part of the fourth level of the road of Tao Master and had even broken the road of Tao Master into a state of chaos. Let alone invading it, even approaching a certain range of the road of Tao Master would be shredded and destroyed. But now, it was clear that the fluctuations coming from the light of heaven and earth were a kind of probing fluctuation that belonged to the will of heaven and earth. This kind of fluctuation was so mysterious that even Luo Fan could not understand it. There was no need to mention its subtlety and strength. At this moment, these fluctuations almost completely ignored the impact that could even break the Tao Master's path, and directly penetrated into the battlefield between the rough young man and the Tao Master's disciple, and directly saw their figures fighting. In an instant, endless information appeared inside the light of heaven and earth, and poured into Luo Fan's heart through the connection between the light of heaven and earth, and became his memory. The amount of information was incomparably huge. It was even thousands of times more information than what he had obtained with the help of the general trend before. However, just like before, this information was also strange and profound beyond imagination. Even if he clearly knew where they came from, even if he clearly knew what this information represented, he couldn't obtain any useful information from this information at all. It was as if this was just a messy, disorderly chaotic information without any content, sure enough. Looking at the endless information, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. This was the reason why he did not use the will of heaven and earth to explore what he could not see before. Although the will of heaven and earth was incomparably mysterious, and could even understand all kinds of things in the state of chaos, there should be no problem for it to see through the battle between the Tao Master's disciple and the rough young man. However, the difference between his way of thinking and that of the will of heaven and earth was really too big. Even if the will of heaven and earth tried its best to cooperate with him and make the information into a state that he could understand, it was still difficult for him to understand. In contrast, it was possible to understand it with the help of the general trend. This was the fundamental reason why he had made the choice just now. At this time, after Luo Fan sighed, he did not immediately begin to immerse his mind into the countless pieces of information to comprehend the various mysteries of these pieces of information and to dig out the many hidden principles of cultivation. Chapter 2304. When these two types of information were mixed together, it was naturally impossible for there to be any seamless integration. It instantly became incomparably smooth, and all the confusion completely disappeared. Music, literature, novel in reality, at this moment, the information instantly became even more chaotic. It was even more chaotic than when the two were in an independent state. This was to be expected. There was actually no connection between the will of the universe within the light of the universe and the light condensed from the general trend. Under such circumstances, how could the two of them complement each other and work together? However, seeing this, Luo Fan did not feel disappointed. In the first place, he did not expect to be able to reveal all the principles and mysteries in the information as soon as he mixed the two together. At this moment, waves of his consciousness continuously flowed into the light formed by the light of the universe and the general trend above his head, allowing his consciousness to adjust the two and adjust the relationship between them. This caused the countless information that poured into his mind through the two to undergo various subtle changes in the process. With this change, the extremely chaotic information in his mind also began to change. Most of the changes in the information were in a more chaotic direction. However, there was also a small trend, or rather, for a short period of time, these changes would change in an orderly direction. However, this was inevitable. If two completely incompatible individuals were to overlap, and if they were to coincide, there would naturally be a higher chance that the two of them would have no similarities at all. However, if adjustments were made, there would ultimately be some details that could be adjusted to fit together. This was just like the information transmitted by the will of the universe and the general trend light at this moment. At a certain moment, when Luo Fan adjusted the two types of information to a certain state, an indescribable and intermittent order directly appeared among the countless information. Through this order, Luo Fan instantly felt that his mind was ringing with morning bells and evening drums. It was as if his mind had become incomparably clear in an instant. Many mysteries that were originally still vague had become incomparably clear in the blink of an eye. In an instant, his cultivation realm began to rise at a visible rate, and his worldview that could only be perfected a little after a long time also began to be perfected at an unimaginable speed. It was as if they had all become an empty water tank, and at this moment there was endless fresh water constantly pouring into this water tank from the outside. With this improvement, Luo Fan's eyes became misty. Faintly, he could already vaguely see the scene of the battle between the rough youth and the disciples of the Tao Master through his eyes. He saw them constantly changing positions and postures in this area that was not much different from the huge whirlpool. With this change, the countless information in his mind began to automatically change at this moment. Amidst these changes, the originally chaotic appearance began to gradually change. The little bits of order that could only occasionally appear began to increase, and the area that they occupied became wider and wider. And in this way, the mysteries revealed from the battle between the rough youth and the disciples of the Tao Master revealed more and more. This situation obviously started a perfect virtuous cycle, causing Luo Fan's cultivation realm to rise bit by bit. And the time for his sixth tribulation also continued to advance in this process. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, and in this process, time also continued to pass bit by bit. For existences at their level, time had already become an existence similar to an attribute, let alone for the experts at a higher level. Obviously, for the rough youth and the disciples of the Tao Master, the time of battle was completely meaningless to them. Whether it was an instant, 100 million years, or 1 billion years, the weight in their hearts was not much different. In this process, in Luo Fan's perception, tens of millions of years had passed unknowingly. And during this period of time, the battle that affected an extremely wide range was still going on unhurriedly, as if there was no difference compared to the beginning. Compared to their battle, after such a long time, Luo Fan also felt that his cultivation realm had made unimaginable progress. Although watching them fight still could not be as clear as facing the battle of existences at the same level, it was already many times clearer than before. At least, when he looked at them again, it was only a little blurry. If he paid attention to one of the key points, he would be able to see some key points clearly in contrast to this change in perspective. His cultivation realm had already improved a lot compared to before. The perfection of his worldview was already an improvement that could be seen by almost any ordinary person. At this moment, Luo Fan's body was already filled with an indescribable aura. It was an extremely subtle and repelling aura that the fourth level could no longer accommodate. The existence of this aura almost made people feel that in the next moment, Luo Fan would be repelled out of the fourth level and into the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. The power of the Tao Master's purgatory, which had descended because of the battle between the rough-looking young man and the disciples of the Tao Master, began to gather around his body, as if it wanted to directly affect him, but could not do so due to some scruples. In addition to these changes in his body, there was another change that Luo Fan was more concerned about. That was, the time when his sixth tribulation would descend. In his perception, the time when his sixth tribulation would descend had been reduced from the original 3 trillion years to 3 trillion years. This was more than 100 billion years ahead of time. It was easy to imagine the extent of his improvement. What a pity! At this moment, a sigh suddenly came from the mouth of the disciples of the Tao Master. Along with this sigh, the fierce battle that covered an area that was not much smaller than the area of the vortex suddenly came to a halt. Countless images, boundless power, and all sorts of movements caused by the impact of their battle completely disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if they had never appeared in the first place. It is indeed a pity. If my main body was here, this battle wouldn't have ended so indifferently. The boorish youth also spoke. Their voices contained a kind of indescribable regret at this moment, as if there was something that did not develop in accordance with their wishes and could not satisfy them. And from the content of their conversation, it could be seen that this was not in line with their wishes. What they couldn't satisfy was none other than the battle that had happened between the two of them. It was a battle that was enough to shock all the cultivators on the fourth floor. Even Luo Fan could feel that he had comprehended countless things from it at this moment. Such a battle is actually indifferent to them. Even though he had some speculations in his heart before, when he heard the confirmation from their mouths, Luo Fan was still a little shocked. It should be known that the horror of this battle could be seen from the disciples of the Tao Master and the rogue cultivators who were like cowards. And yet, such a battle seemed to be carried out by the two of them just to suppress him. Next time, let's fight with our bodies. The disciple of the Tao Master invited. When he heard this, the rough young man laughed and said, "Then forget it. It is too dangerous to fight with your body. I can't find any reason to take this risk." Sigh. The disciple of the Tao Master sighed and glanced at Luo Fan with a strange look in his eyes. Then, his figure slowly dissipated, and in the blink of an eye, he had disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared. At this time, the forthright young man also glanced at Luo Fan with a smile on his face and said, "Next, you can do it according to your own ideas. You don't have to care about anything else. Just now you won, right? Don't you care about his mission here?" Seeing that the rough youth seemed to be about to disappear, Luo Fan hurriedly said. Hearing this, the rough youth smiled again and said, "Of course I won. If I didn't win, why would he dissipate first? As for his mission here, you don't have to care about it. That's the big situation between us rogue cultivators and the disciples of the Tao Master. For you, it's still too far away. Knowing too much will only bring you harm." When Luo Fan heard this, a bitter smile appeared on his face and he said, "This kind of attitude is really abhorrent. Haha, there's no other way. Your strength is here. If you want to know more and obtain more, then hurry up and become stronger." The forthright young man laughed heartily, and his figure gradually dissipated. In the blink of an eye, there was no trace of his existence in the fourth level. At the same time, the shock waves from the battle between the rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple began to rapidly dissipate. Unknowingly, it had already disappeared without a trace, causing the entire fourth level to return to how it was 10 million years ago. The rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple from the higher echelons had yet to appear. Become stronger. How many years has it been since I've heard someone say this to me? Luo Fan sighed and murmured. Become stronger. When you become stronger, you will be able to know what you want to know and obtain what you want to obtain. This kind of words was usually said to others. He didn't expect others to use it on him. This kind of feeling was quite strange to him. However, the battle between the two of them was just a strange existence that was not even comparable to a projection, but it had already taken him tens of millions of years to see it clearly. This was enough to prove that they were qualified to say such words to him. At that moment, although he was displeased, he could only suppress this displeasure and earnestly comprehend and absorb the various mysterious mysteries that he had obtained from the process of their battle. After the two of them dissipated, the power from the Tao Master's prison began to gradually disappear. Even the power that had been hovering around Luo Fan's body, as if it was looking for an opportunity to give Luo Fan a ruthless blow and pull Luo Fan into the depths of the Tao Master's prison, had also disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Sensing the disappearance of the power from the Tao Master's prison, Luo Fan only revealed a faint smile on his face, but did not say anything else. His current strength had clearly exceeded the range that the fourth level of the Tao Master's path could accommodate. Because of this, the power of the Tao Master's prison would appear around him, ready to pull him into the depths of the Tao Master's prison and suppress him. However, he was indeed a cultivator on the fourth level. His ascension process on the Tao Master's path had indeed led him to the fourth level. Under such circumstances, no matter how powerful he was, or how terrifying the power he had obtained, it was in line with the rules of the Tao Master's path. In this way, it was impossible for the power of the Tao Master's prison to pull him into the depths of the Tao Master's prison and suppress him. It could only obediently watch him stay here, and watch him obtain more resources and improve even more. Of course, the prerequisite was that he would not be expelled from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path before he completed the prerequisite of ascension and be forcefully sent to the fifth level. Given the current direction of development, there was a high possibility of such a situation happening. With a thought, the light that was condensed from the power began to disperse once again. In the blink of an eye, it had expanded from a small ball to several tens of feet in size. Its brightness also began to weaken as it expanded. It looked as if the light had been dispersed into the area within a radius of several tens of feet. The area that the power occupied continued to expand, and its brightness continued to weaken. Not long after, the aura had once again dispersed to every inch of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, and its brightness had completely disappeared. Not even the slightest bit could be seen. But this was the general trend returning to its original state. With the recovery of the power, all the cultivators on the fourth level suddenly felt a sense of fullness, as if their long-lost existence had suddenly returned. Chapter 2305. When the general trend was extracted and returned, what was extracted and returned in the hearts of the cultivators was none other than the deep connection between the cultivators and the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path. When the general trend was extracted, although the cultivators were still in the fourth level, they were fundamentally incompatible with the Tao Sovereign's path. Even if they wanted to mobilize the power of the Tao Sovereign's path and comprehend something from it, they would need to go through many more steps than before. It was precisely because of this that not many of the cultivators were able to make any real progress during the tens of millions of years that the general trend had been drawn away. All of them were stuck at the same cultivation realm, let alone ascending. And this change was triggered by the battle between the rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciples. It was covered up by the turbulence of the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path, so it did not attract much attention. Those whose power had increased or broken through only thought that it was because of the turbulence of the fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path that they could not improve or break through. They did not know that the reason behind it was actually the general trend. Luo Fan could faintly sense all of this, but he was not very clear about it. It was not that he did not have the ability to understand this, but he did not have the mood to pay attention to it. For him, from the beginning until now, the most important thing was still his own cultivation realm, and it was still his own world view of the laws. At this moment, after experiencing and comprehending for tens of millions of years, he had already accumulated an extremely deep foundation. Whether it was his own world cluster, the entire fourth level of the Tao Sovereign's path, or even the many other levels besides the real world, he already had a further idea of how to improve. At this moment, there was an indescribable impulse in his heart. It was an impulse to dig deep into all the mysteries within, to completely transform all the mysteries within into his own cultivation realm, and to transform it into his own worldview of the world. With this impulse, it meant that he was about to enter a peak of cultivation realm improvement. In this way, there was no need to say anything about what he should choose. At this moment, Luo Fan had already closed his eyes that had been opened for tens of millions of years. The light of heaven and earth above his head also began to slowly spread. Not long after, it had spread to the entire world group, causing the entire world group to be enveloped by the light that was like a living creature. Everything within it gradually changed, and the entire process became even more mysterious and profound. Countless similar but slightly different messages poured into Luo Fan's mind from the will of the world within the light of heaven and earth. Compared to the past, Luo Fan needed to spend endless energy to deduce this kind of information to be able to understand bit by bit. Now, although Luo Fan couldn't fully understand this information, he already had a template for analyzing this information in his heart. Through this template, a large portion of this information seemed to become something that he could understand very quickly. In this way, the gains he obtained at every moment were naturally much greater than before. Even his cultivation realm began to wriggle at a speed visible to the naked eye during this process. However, the information that could be converted by this template into information that he could understand was only a very, very small part of the infinite information. Among them, there was still a large portion of the information that was in a strange state that was similar to chaos. It was still within the realm that he could not understand, and this was something that he needed to spend a large amount of effort to comprehend and understand. At the same time, on the other planes, the existences that corresponded to Luo Fan began to do something that they had never done before. All sorts of subtle tremors appeared between the many planes. The tremors were different because of the different planes, but no matter how different the tremors were, they all pointed to a single goal. That was to strengthen the existence's understanding and control of the surroundings in that plane. All along, Luo Fan had connected the many planes together, allowing them to complement and promote each other. This allowed the existences that corresponded to any plane to be able to replenish themselves through the connections between the many planes, allowing them to completely recover in the end. However, in the end, his use of the various planes stopped at this level. If he wanted to have a deeper control over those planes, and if he wanted to operate those planes in a more profound manner than simply using them, he simply could not do it. Originally, Luo Fan did not care about this kind of restriction. After all, just the communication and complementation of the various planes was already enough to allow him to obtain endless benefits, and it was even close to giving him an immortal body. Previously, when he faced the waxen middle-aged man from the 6th floor, and when he faced senior sister May from the 5th floor, he had relied on this characteristic to win. However, it was clear that the battle between the forthright young man and the Tao Master's disciple had finally made him realize that this level of use of the various planes was far from enough. One had to know that the two of them were only cultivators from the 8th and 7th floor. Even such existences were able to instinctively involve their power in many planes, causing the existences that corresponded to them to not only be unable to pose a threat to them, but also cause the existences that corresponded to them to be greatly threatened. If it wasn't for the fact that the forthright young man and the Tao Master's disciple had equal strength and were on opposing sides, he even suspected that he might not have been able to survive until now, even if he had the ability to communicate and complement each other. In addition, the various extremely subtle changes that occurred during the entire process of their power seeping into the various planes had given him enough inspiration, allowing him to have a further understanding of the relationship between the various planes. This allowed him to find a way to increase his control over the existences that corresponded to the various planes, as well as the direction in which he could control them. This was also the reason why he was able to start this kind of operation at this moment. The trembling reverberated between the many planes. Due to the secret connection between the existences that corresponded to Luo Fan, the trembling also faintly communicated with each other and produced a subtle resonance. The light of the world was an existence that possessed the will of the world. Such an existence was naturally not something that could be restricted by a single level. The light between the heavens and earth also existed between the many layers. However, due to the characteristics of the different levels, the light of heaven and earth's performance was also different between the levels. Due to the problem of the plane itself, even though Luo Fan was the owner of the light of the world, it was difficult for him to understand the various changes that occurred between the various planes. He could even roughly determine which existences represented the light of the world in those planes. Naturally, Luo Fan had expected this situation. However, he did not feel discouraged. He only adjusted the subtle trembling of the existences that corresponded to the various planes, trying his best to make these trembling more resonant and break the shackles that prevented him from having a deeper understanding of those planes. Every plane was a mysterious existence that was similar to the reality plane. The amount that could be comprehended in the reality plane was the amount that could be comprehended in each plane. It was completely impossible for Luo Fan to comprehend the mysteries between the various planes with the same method that he used to comprehend the mysteries of the reality plane. After all, the realms were endless. Luo Fan had already spent so many years comprehending the realms of reality, and he had spent so much energy on it. If he were to repeat this process countless times, even if he had the patience and energy to expend, the impending disaster would definitely not give him such a chance. 3 trillion years might seem very long, and it was an unimaginably long period of time for ordinary people. However, for an existence at Luo Fan's level, this bit of time was nothing at all. If he was not careful, this bit of time would slip away from his hands, and not even the slightest bit would remain. In this way, spending endless energy and time to comprehend the mysteries of each plane from the beginning was simply squandering the time that he did not have. How could he make such a choice? If it was in the past, he naturally would not have thought about it. However, at this time, after experiencing the battle between the forthright young man and the Tao Master's disciples, he had a new idea. The connection between the planes is definitely closer than I thought. The mysteries of different planes are obviously not absolutely independent. Through some kind of indescribable conversion, the mysteries of different planes can definitely be converted into each other. This was the kind of enlightenment that he had developed during those millions of years. It was also because of this enlightenment that he was so duty-bound to devote his energy to the effort to control the mysteries of various planes at this time. The quakes between the different planes were constantly changing. In the first millions of years, no matter how the quakes changed, it was difficult to achieve the goal that Luo Fan wanted, to make the quakes resonate with the planes and break the shackles. This was the case no matter which plane it was. However, as time passed, gradually, an indescribable subtle feeling spread to more and more planes, where the corresponding existence of Luo Fan was. This was an extremely subtle feeling that could not even be described with words. However, in reality, Luo Fan had existed in reality for a long time. In fact, he already had an extremely strong feeling when he was born. Even Luo Fan didn't realize that he already had such a feeling in the real world until this subtle and inexplicable feeling appeared in many layers. Moreover, compared to the other layers, this feeling was tens of thousands of times stronger than the feeling he had when he had just started to show signs of it. So, the real key is here. At this moment, an indescribable tremble appeared in Luo Fan's heart. In the midst of this trembling, his body in the real plane suddenly opened its eyes. The originally calm light of heaven and earth that covered his entire world began to tremble indescribably at this moment. In this tremble, Luo Fan felt every movement of the light of heaven and earth like never before. He clearly felt the breathing of the light of heaven and earth that he had not felt before. In a trance, he discovered that the existences corresponding to him in those planes had suddenly formed an extremely weak connection with the existences corresponding to the light of heaven and earth in those planes. It was so weak that it made people suspect that it did not exist at all. It was as if, at this moment, an extremely weak connection between him and the light of heaven and earth in reality had unknowingly been transferred to many other planes. With this feeling, the aura that was rejected by the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path suddenly increased by several times. Faintly, there was even the power of the Tao Master's prison lingering in all directions, as if it could descend at any time and directly affect him. And in contrast to this direct change, in Luo Fan's perception, the sixth tribulation that should have taken 3 trillion years to descend suddenly advanced, and in the blink of an eye, it had already advanced to 900 billion years. Even if he had long expected that once he completed this step of cultivation, his cultivation realm would make great progress, such a huge progress still made Luo Fan feel incredulous. How is this possible? It's just a little bit of connection, how can there be such amazing progress? Previously, it took me such a long time to comprehend the high-level occultism that the two people displayed, but it only shortened the time by 1 trillion years. At this moment, such a thought appeared in his mind out of nowhere, causing his mood to become extremely agitated. And this agitation in his mood also caused the light of heaven and earth to similarly agitate, which then stirred the endless power of creation around the world group, causing the power of creation to produce indescribable waves that began to surge in all directions. It looked like there was an invisible giant hand stirring the power of creation. Naturally, Luo Fan quickly figured out the meaning of this strange change. This clearly meant that what he had just comprehended was something that only existed in the real world. He had only just found a little bit of the corresponding existence in other worlds. That kind of subtle feeling was more important than he had imagined. It could even be said that the degree of importance was not much less than his independent world view. Chapter 2306. While Luo Fan was shocked by the huge improvement in his cultivation realm, he also felt an inexplicable excitement. After all, he had found a path that led to the heavens now, he had only obtained this subtle feeling, and it had already improved his cultivation realm to this extent. If this feeling was strengthened in the future, wouldn't his cultivation realm improve even more? If this improvement, combined with the improvement of his worldview, it would obviously have unimaginable benefits for his cultivation realm and strength. At the very least, compared to before, it was much easier for him to improve his cultivation realm with the help of subtle perception, which was different from the way he improved the world cluster. Moreover, this subtle feeling was not only helpful for improving his cultivation realm, but more importantly, it revealed the existence of a whole new world that Luo Fan had never thought of before. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind. In the real world, Luo Fan closed his eyes again, and his body and mind once again sank into the comprehension of the subtle feeling that he had just discovered. At the same time, his corresponding existences in other realms also started to lock on to that feeling with all their might. For two identical paintings, if one of them was highlighted with an extremely eye-catching color, and the other painting was left untouched, then the observer would definitely focus his attention on that particular detail in the other painting that was highlighted with a special color. With comparison, it was easy to discover. By the same logic, if this kind of weak and subtle feeling did not have a sense that was many times stronger in reality as a comparison, even Luo Fan would not be able to easily lock onto it in other planes. After all, the feeling that existed in those many planes was too weak. It was so weak that even Luo Fan could only sense a little bit of it. It was impossible for him to lock onto it out of thin air. However, there was still a comparison. No matter how weak it was, very soon, he had completely locked on to this subtle feeling. For something like a feeling, the more one locked onto it, the stronger it would be. It doesn't matter if you want to strengthen or weaken this feeling. It was like when one reminded someone not to think about something. When one heard not to think about something, the first thing that appeared in one's mind would definitely be something. Therefore, even if Luo Fan just locked on to that feeling, he was actually strengthening it. It was just that this strengthening speed was unimaginably slow. Luo Fan roughly weighed it. If he didn't have any other means and only relied on this kind of perception to strengthen itself at this speed, even if there was no bottleneck, this kind of enhancement could be endless. He was afraid that it would take countless trillions of years to reach the intensity of the perception he had in the real world. For Luo Fan, who was only facing the sixth great calamity in 900 billion years, this strengthening speed obviously did not meet his requirements. Only in the real world can there be an innate existence, and my control over my existence in the real world far surpasses that of other realms. From this, it can be seen that there must be some extremely mysterious connection between this feeling and my control over realms. Luo Fan thought to himself, and all sorts of thoughts and information continuously emerged in his mind. In a trance, that subtle feeling seemed to have turned into a thread. It looked extremely small and ordinary, but behind it was connected to an incomparably huge and even more subtle heaven and earth thread. However, one also needed to see what it was to understand the whole picture. Seeing a map might be able to deduce the size of the entire planet. If one's reasoning ability was a bit stronger, they might be able to deduce the rotation speed of the planet and its revolution speed. However, if one wanted to know the existence of the vast world behind a line after seeing it, it would not be that easy. As Luo Fan tried his best to understand, time passed bit by bit. In the blink of an eye, another 1,000,000 years had passed. In these 1,000,000 years, Luo Fan's understanding of that subtle feeling deepened bit by bit, and the strange world behind that subtle feeling was also gradually unraveling the fog that shrouded it. There was actually no difference between the many realms, and there was no distinction between primary and secondary. For all living beings and all cultivators, every realm was equally important. For living beings, if a problem occurred on any realm, it would be an incomparably serious problem that could cause a living being to die an unnatural death. Even with Luo Fan's vast knowledge, he had never seen anyone else other than himself who could communicate with so many realms, and make any problems on any one of them become minor problems. He was able to do this because he had spent a lot of effort to communicate with the corresponding existences between his own reality and the many other realms. If he had not put in so much effort, even he would not have been able to obtain this almost indestructible characteristic. However, even though this was the truth, for almost all cultivators, the reality was actually a realm that surpassed all other realms. For them, their own heaven and earth, their own world, seemed to only be included in the reality. The other realms seemed to not exist at all for them. The reason for this situation was none other than the fact that Luo Fan had been working hard to study the mysteries of the reality for the past 1,000,000 years. He had to spend a lot of effort to obtain a trace of subtle feeling in the other realms. Luo Fan had pondered and studied this phenomenon for 1,000,000 years. All kinds of ideas and inspirations appeared in his mind, and they were enough to make the mind of an ordinary fourth tribulation powerhouse collapse. In the end, after experiencing 1,000,000 years, he was finally enlightened, and he suddenly understood what this feeling was. He also understood what that feeling represented, what that boundless and vast world was. "So, this is real," he murmured, and countless information frantically emerged from his heart. It began to reorganize and reconstruct itself even more frantically. This real was not the real opposite of fake, but the real of truth, the real of reality, and the real of a true sage. The reason why all cultivators considered the reality to be their everything, whereas the other planes were completely ignored, was because to them, only the reality possessed this sort of truth, and the other planes didn't possess this sort of truth. In some cultivation systems, cultivators were also called cultivators, and what they cultivated was this real. Although that cultivation system had a lot of omissions in its understanding of real, in the view of the current Luofan, it was really full of mistakes and had no reference value. However, the fundamental idea of that cultivation system coincided with his current understanding. Now, among the countless information that emerged from the depths of Luofan's heart, in addition to his huge cultivation achievements, the more important information was what he had obtained before. In the process of the battle between the rough young man and the disciples of the Tao Master, he had obtained a lot of information that he could not understand through the light of the general trend and the light of heaven and earth. And these information that he could not understand, after a variety of subtle and inexplicable reorganization, were quickly transformed into something that he could easily understand and quickly comprehend. In the end, he felt that his cultivation realm began to increase at an unimaginable speed. It also caused his worldview to be more and more perfected. With this change, he felt that the sixth great tribulation that would have taken him 900 billion years to descend had been brought forward at an unimaginable speed.
89,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,9
999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,9 999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,999,9 years. In just a few dozen breaths, the time for the Great Tribulation to descend had been reduced to less than 800 billion years. In another few dozen breaths, it was further reduced to 700 billion years. In this way, when Luo Fan came back to his senses, the time for the sixth Great Tribulation to descend was already less than a billion years. Sensing this, Luo Fan was both happy and helpless for a moment. Originally, when the Great Tribulation was going to descend 3 trillion years later, he felt that there was enough time for him to properly improve himself and prepare to survive this earth-shaking Great Tribulation. However, he did not expect that after just a few comprehensions the 3 trillion years had already been reduced to less than a billion years. The speed of the reduction was truly too fast for him to react. The reduction in the time for the Great Tribulation meant that his cultivation realm had improved. The reduction in the time meant that his cultivation realm had improved rapidly, which was naturally a good thing and worthy of his joy. However, it was so fast that he could not even react, so fast that he could not even prepare for the arrival of the Great Tribulation. This was clearly not a good thing. At this moment, an inexplicable sense of urgency emerged from the bottom of his heart. The sixth Great Tribulation would definitely be more terrifying than the fifth Great Tribulation. Back then, he was already struggling to overcome the fifth great tribulation. If it was not for that true saint who gave him some help, he even suspected that he might have knelt during the fifth great tribulation. In this way, even though his cultivation realm had improved by countless times compared to before, and he had even grasped the powerful light of heaven and earth, he still did not have enough confidence that he could definitely overcome the sixth great tribulation. With a slight thought, the time around his body stagnated. This stagnation was only within the scope of his world group, but the effect of the stagnation was more powerful than the changes. He could directly manipulate the world group. It felt like even the light of heaven and earth seemed to have a subtle stagnation because of this stagnation. Although it was not much, it was already an incredible miracle. After all, this was the light of heaven and earth that had the will of heaven and earth. To be able to affect it, it was enough to show that the stagnation of time was enough to even affect the incomprehensible will of heaven and earth. This method of freezing was quite similar to the method used by the waxen middle-aged man who had gone against the flow from the sixth level back then. Although the stagnation method used by the waxen middle-aged man covered the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path, Luo Fan's stagnation method was only limited to his world group. Although I can barely do it, after all, it's only on the surface. There's no way to get the essence. With a slight thought, Luo Fan sighed and let go of the stagnation of time. The purpose of using this stagnation method was naturally to test the mystery of the method used by the waxen middle-aged man that he had comprehended from the countless information that had been dug out from the depths of his heart. Reality also proved that he had indeed comprehended from the information he had received. However, because it was only based on the information in his memory, he did not see the waxen middle-aged man use this stagnation method again when he had the ability to comprehend it, nor did he really come into contact with the sixth level of the Tao Master's path that the waxen middle-aged man had comprehended this stagnation method. Therefore, his current stagnation of time was greatly limited, and he could not even break through the scope of his own world group. After experimenting with what he had just comprehended, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and he discovered something that he hadn't discovered before: the changes in his corresponding existence on other levels. At this moment, he could already feel that the sense of truth that he had obtained from his corresponding existences on other planes had increased by countless times. Although it was still far from the perception in the real world, it was enough to easily crush their selves 1,000,000 years ago. And with the change that occurred with the enhancement of this perception, Luo Fan's control of his corresponding existences in various levels had leaped to a level that was completely incomparable to before. In the past, his corresponding existences in various levels were like a patient who could not move his body flexibly. He could clearly perceive himself and slightly manipulate himself, but he could not really do what he wanted to do freely like an ordinary person in the real world. But now, he was like a person who had recovered and even cultivated some kind of qigong, and his strength had far surpassed that of an ordinary person. For example, in the conceptual level, his concept of existence had easily come before the concept of existence of the light of heaven and earth, and he could easily attract the concept of existence of the light of heaven and earth to his head, just like what his body in the real world had done before. Chapter 2307. The light of heaven and earth was a supreme existence that surpassed the individual levels. The will of heaven and earth was not something that could be restricted by any level. Even the barrier between different levels was an insignificant existence to him. Therefore, even though Luo Fan had spent a lot of effort to condense the light of heaven and earth in the real world, in fact, the existence corresponding to the light of heaven and earth would have all the power it possessed in the real world in any other world. The reason why it had not been shown was because Luo Fan could not touch it in many levels. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan's strength in many planes had been strengthened, and he could barely do all the things that ordinary people could do in the real world. Very soon, he could clearly feel the supreme might of the light of heaven and earth in many planes. as the existence corresponding to him in many levels was shrouded by the existence corresponding to the light of heaven and earth. The sense of security that could only be felt in the real world finally appeared in many levels. At this moment, there was a repulsive force acting on Luo Fan and the existence corresponding to him in all levels. Under this repulsive force, the existence corresponding to him began to uncontrollably move towards an extremely mysterious place. Because he was not very familiar with the other levels, Luo Fan did not know where the mysterious place he was being repelled to was. However, he was also undergoing the same change in the real world. Similarly, he was being repelled to a mysterious place. And this, for him, was obviously no longer a secret. In the real world, at this moment, his world group began to gather towards his light of heaven and earth in an indescribable way. In just a flash, all the heavens and earth, all the worlds, all the space-time in the entire world group had been completely integrated into the light of heaven and earth, leaving only the vast light of heaven and earth around Luo Fan. Apart from that, there was only the endless creation power. And at this moment, the repulsive force was pushing his body, pushing his light of heaven and earth, pushing him out of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. This clearly meant that the fourth level of the Tao Master's path could no longer accommodate his existence and was about to forcibly push him out of the fourth level. The condition for ascension to the fourth level of the Tao Master's path was to completely integrate the world group into the power abstracted from the world group. However, for ordinary cultivators, even if they had a lot of resources and could start the process of ascending at any time, just to comprehend more of the mysteries of the fourth level, they would need to obediently fuse with the world cluster bit by bit and use the power of the world cluster to completely assimilate the entire world cluster. However, they had never been like Luo Fan. It was not him who took the initiative to fuse with the world cluster, but the world cluster itself began to fuse with it. Moreover, compared to the other cultivators who had fused with the power of the world group, what Luo Fan had fused with was the light of heaven and earth, which was several levels stronger than the power of the world group and contained the will of the world. These differences were enough to show that Luo Fan's light of world group's state at this moment was the difference between the world and Luo Fan's and the other cultivators' state. In the face of such an encounter, Luo Fan did not have time to think about it at this moment. This was because as the world group fused with the light of heaven and earth, his perception of the world group, the light of heaven and earth, his perception of the various layers, and even his perception of the world view of laws had undergone an earth-shattering change. These countless changes had completely occupied his mind, occupied his perception, and occupied his everything. Under such circumstances, he could no longer sense the changes in the outside world and the changes that had happened to him. The world group that was born from the endless power of creation in the fourth level represented all of his past experiences, all of his cultivation achievements, and even his existence under such circumstances. After the world group integrated into the light of heaven and earth, the light of heaven and earth seemed to have instantly crossed the river of time and returned to the past, as if it had integrated with him from the past. In a trance, an almost instinctive feeling appeared between Luo Fan and the light of heaven and earth. It was as if all of a sudden, his affinity with the light of heaven and earth had been strengthened to a level that was like he was born with it. Under such changes, Luo Fan's understanding of the various subtle information that the light of heaven and earth was constantly transmitting to him was suddenly strengthened beyond imagination. Many of the information that had been vague to him suddenly became extremely clear, as if they had become instinctive knowledge. He did not even need to understand or control them anymore. As for those things that he couldn't understand before, he could now vaguely sense them and vaguely understand them. Just this little change allowed his cultivation realm to increase at an even faster rate. The sixth great tribulation that would have taken close to 1 billion years to descend was like a jump, but it had suddenly skipped over this period of close to 1 billion years. Before Luo Fan could prepare himself, it had already arrived above his head. In that instant, the repulsive force that had appeared on many planes and was repelling him and his corresponding existence towards a certain mysterious place abruptly vanished, while he himself entered an unimaginably wondrous place. An unimaginable sense of danger shrouded him at this moment. This sense of danger was not just limited to the reality level, but also spread to all other levels, enveloping his corresponding existences in countless levels. This sense of danger was more than 10 times stronger than the sense of danger he had felt when he encountered the fifth Great Tribulation. Under this sense of danger, Luo Fan only felt like his body and mind were going to collapse in the next moment, and his soul was going to scatter. The sixth Great Tribulation. After coming back to his senses, Luo Fan smiled bitterly. The development of things really made him a little unable to react. The original 3 trillion years suddenly became 900 billion years, and before he could react, the 900 billion years had already become less than a billion years. And now this billion years had been completely skipped in a flash. The Great Tribulation had actually directly descended on him while he was preparing, pulling him into this strange place that the Great Tribulation had opened up. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth around Luo Fan's body had already converged into the shape of a cloud that appeared above his head. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth around Luo Fan's body had already converged into the shape of a cloud that appeared above his head. Instead, it seemed to contain a starry sky, which was decorated with countless stars, making the light and the cloud appear extremely mysterious and profound. It was as if all the principles and mysteries in the universe had been contained within it. And around him, outside the range of the light of heaven and earth, was a boundless, turbid existence that was almost black. This turbid existence seemed to contain time, space, matter, and energy, but also seemed to not exist at all. In it, Luo Fan could clearly feel an indescribable pressure constantly coming towards him. Under this pressure, the effect of the light of heaven and earth that floated above his head to protect him was only slightly better than nothing. In other words, although there was some effect, it was not obvious, this was the reality, but the situation in other planes was also extremely similar. There were also endless indescribable strange existences surrounding the existences that corresponded to him in the other planes. And similarly, the light of heaven and earth was also protecting him, doing its best to resist the various threats from the outside world. However, it was clear that the reality was still the focus of this Great Tribulation. Although there were threats on other planes as well, this kind of threat was more instinctive and unconscious. It was like the threat of the changes in the weather to everything within its range. It was very clear that, at least in this Great Tribulation, the status of the other planes was obviously not comparable to the reality. This situation made Luo Fan breathe a sigh of relief. At least, from a certain point of view, he was already ahead of the sixth Great Tribulation in the fourth layer of the Path of Tao Master. When Luo Fan's body changed, the entire fourth layer began to tremble violently. This trembling came from the root of the fourth layer, and it affected everything in the fourth layer, including all the creation power, all the worlds and all the cultivators in it. The cultivators in the fourth layer were, after all, experts of the fourth tribulation. Although they were far inferior to Luo Fan, they were by no means ordinary. Therefore, although the trembling came from the depths of the fourth layer, and even caused them to tremble at the same time, they still clearly felt the existence of the trembling. Ordinary living beings would never be able to detect the existence of such tremors under such synchronized tremors. What's going on? What happened this time? One after another, a panicked emotion arose in the hearts of the cultivators. After all, ever since Luo Fan entered the fourth level, there would be huge changes in the fourth level of the Road of Tao Master almost every once in a while. And each change was a huge test for them. Not to mention the last change that seemed to be the safest, they had yet to fully recover from it. Currently, many cultivators were still immersed in the aftertaste of the way to survive in the light of heaven and earth, and it would take a long time for them to recover, the trembling from the depths of the fourth layer, in their senses, was obviously in the style of Luo Fan using some amazing means. Therefore, they immediately set their sights on Luo Fan. For a moment, senses swept towards the location of Luo Fan's world group from all directions. When their senses converged in this empty area of the creation power, none of the cultivators could believe what they sensed. He's gone? How did he leave? Why aren't there any signs of ascension? Did he go against the path of Tao Master? Doubts and thoughts appeared in their minds one after another, causing them to feel bewildered. Normally, with Luo Fan's strength and means, he should have ascended and left the fourth layer of the path of Tao Master. But they had seen it so many times, how could they not know what it was like? Where was the light of ascension that spread throughout the fourth layer? Where was the transcendent aura? Where was the light of guidance that descended from the sky? There was nothing. How could this be considered ascension? After a long while, cultivators came to the place where Luo Fan's world group disappeared, and searched for the traces left behind here in confusion. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan had left too decisively and thoroughly. Even though many of these cultivators were disciples of Tao Masters with countless divine senses and infinite power, and many of the individual cultivators were quite experienced in tracking and sensing traces, they could not find any traces left by Luo Fan here. The power of creation here seemed to have existed since ancient times. There was not the slightest trace of abnormality, and there was not the slightest trace of abnormality left behind after several years. Those cultivators finally came to the conclusion that Luo Fan had really left the fourth layer in a way that they could not understand. They finally had true freedom. An indescribable joy began to accumulate in the hearts of many cultivators, and a relaxed atmosphere began to spread throughout the fourth layer of the path of Tao Master. In this relaxed atmosphere, countless disciples of Tao Masters and individual cultivators felt the shackles that shackled them slowly loosen. They felt that their cultivation realm, which had been suppressed for a long time, began to show signs of loosening. For a moment they even felt that the fourth layer had become incomparably beautiful. Of course, this absolutely beautiful process was obviously short-lived. Without the suppression of a giant like Luo Fan, the contradiction between the disciples of Tao Masters and the individual cultivators finally had no chance to ease. As time went by, the contradiction began to gradually emerge. The friction between the two camps began to increase. If nothing changed and the situation continued to be calm, the contradiction between the two camps would probably last for a long time before it fully erupted. After all, for these cultivators who had been suppressed by Luo Fan for so many years, stability was extremely precious. Even if they were dissatisfied with the cultivators of other camps, it would not be able to suppress their pursuit of stability in a short period of time. Chapter 2308. As Luo Fan was expelled from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, naturally, the various means and abilities he had left behind on the fourth level began to gradually weaken. This included the seal he had placed on the fourth senior brother. It must be known that even if he used a barrier between planes to seal the fourth senior brother, it was not something that the barrier itself could do if he wanted to change the barrier, which was originally very gentle and had no effect on existences in the real world, to target a certain cultivator and seal a certain cultivator within it. It definitely required the cooperation of Luo Fan's willpower, strength, divine abilities, and power at the same time to be possible. Under such circumstances, when Luo Fan left the fourth level and the distance between him and the seal was infinitely enlarged, the willpower, strength, divine abilities, and power he had left on the seal would naturally weaken due to the loss of the source. This sort of weakening would naturally cause the seal to waver. In the end, not long after Luo Fan left the fourth level, the wavering finally reached a certain limit. The fourth senior brother, who should have lost all his willpower and senses in the seal, finally broke free from the shackles and regained a bit of his own willpower. In this way, the result was obvious. The entire fourth level trembled once again. However, this time the tremble did not come from the depths of the fourth level, nor did it cause all the cultivators, the world group, or even everything else to tremble. Such a tremble was obviously more conspicuous and eye-catching to the many cultivators on the fourth level. He's back. This was the first thought that came to the minds of many cultivators. The he they were referring to was naturally Luofan, who they thought had completely ascended and left. From this, it could be seen that Luofan had left a deep shadow in their hearts. For a moment, many cultivators began to feel a little at a loss. They had just gained a little bit of freedom, but they were suddenly told that their nightmares might come back again. It went without saying how painful that feeling was. At this moment, some of the more hot-tempered cultivators had already become hysterical and wanted to rush over to find the source of the tremors. They wanted to strike first and gain the upper hand, directly killing the existence that might be Luofan. Even though they knew that they weren't strong enough and that they might not be able to deal with their opponents, they didn't feel discouraged. Instead, they gave it their all because of this life-and-death crisis. Their potential was greatly stimulated, and they seemed to be much stronger than before. At this moment, an earth-shattering roar came from somewhere, reverberating wildly in the entire fourth layer of the Tao Master's path. This roar contained the joy of breaking free from the shackles, but it also contained the anger of being sealed and shackled. The roar itself shocked many of the cultivators on the fourth layer, but at the same time, it was this roar that made those who had been almost hysterical suddenly calm down. There was no other reason, because they had already heard that the owner of this roar was not Luofan, whom they were most afraid of, but the fourth senior brother. The existence of the fourth senior brother was not a good thing for the many rogue cultivators. At this time, when the conflict between the two camps was getting stronger and stronger, the existence of the fourth senior brother was equivalent to strengthening the strength of the Tao Master, which was equivalent to increasing the pressure on the rogue cultivators. However, this kind of pressure, after all, was still something that they could bear. At least, compared to the despair brought about by the return of Luofan, they were more willing to accept the return of the fourth senior brother. The fourth senior brother roared for a while before gradually calming down. At this time, his figure had already appeared in the place where he had been sealed by Luofan. His fierce aura surged all over his body, constantly spreading in all directions. Under the impact of his aura, the endless power of creation that existed in all directions produced all kinds of strange surges, faintly seeming to give birth to all kinds of strange things. After looking around, the fourth senior brother showed a strange look in his eyes. Did he self-destruct? Ascended? He murmured, his heart full of doubts. It was the fact that he finally discovered the fact that Luofan had disappeared from the fourth layer. And this also made him understand why he was able to break free from the seal and return to the fourth layer of the road to Tao Master. Compared to other cultivators, he knew more and had more speculations about the cause of Luofan's disappearance. Moreover, compared to others, as the fourth senior brother, he had some other means to confirm the whereabouts of Luofan. Because he used to be the fourth senior brother, and as the fourth senior brother, he had some means to contact the fifth layer. To confirm whether Luofan self-destructed because he could not bear the words he had said, or if he had broken through the shackles and ascended to the fifth layer, he only needed to contact the higher-ups to confirm. Because of his fear of Luofan, at this time, confirming Luofan's whereabouts became the fourth senior brother's most important task. At this time, he did not return to his own world cluster, but directly began to walk in this position. Pieces of runes that formed into footprints constantly appeared under his feet, gradually forming a strange and mysterious circle in the endless power of creation as he walked. As this big circle was completed, the many runes gradually began to emit brilliance. These splashes of light were not scattered in all directions. Instead, they were condensed into one in an extremely mysterious manner and shot straight into the sky. From afar, The brilliance looked like tiny ascending rays of light that went straight into the depths of the void, directly breaking through the endless power of creation in the surroundings and disappearing in the depths of the power of creation. As the brilliance became more and more dazzling, the circle that the fourth senior brother walked out of was gradually filled up and gradually turned into a huge pool of light. One could even vaguely see the brilliance flowing endlessly in the circle like flowing water. After a long while, the brilliance gradually faded, and a vague figure appeared above the pool of light. "You're no longer the fourth senior brother," the figure said as soon as it appeared. Hearing this, the fourth senior brother's expression became rather grim. However, he still had a favor to ask of the other party, so he tried his best to suppress his emotions and said, "The fact that I can still contact you shows that I'm still the fourth senior brother." "Alright, you have a point. Tell me, what's the matter this time? You should know that the investigation is very strict now. If you don't have a good reason, even if you're still the fourth senior brother, you definitely won't be able to escape punishment," the figure said indifferently. "I need you to help me investigate a cultivator who has just ascended," the fourth senior brother said. "A cultivator who has just ascended? Although it's not difficult, you still have to give me a reason, right?" the figure said indifferently. The fourth senior brother's expression seemed a little inexplicably nervous, and he said, "Because I suspect that he hasn't ascended at all, and has already killed himself." Hearing this, the figure suddenly froze. It was as if he had heard something unbelievable. Even though the figure was blurry, one could see the disbelief in his body at that moment. After a long while, the figure said with some difficulty, "You can't be talking about that person, right? Of course, apart from him, who else can make me use this method to contact you for confirmation?" the fourth senior brother said indifferently. "In that case, he has already ascended to the 5th floor?" the figure confirmed. "I mean, maybe, he has already killed himself," the fourth senior brother corrected him. The figure only sneered when he heard that. Killed himself? How could someone like that choose to kill himself? If he's that kind of person, how could he force you to this step? The fourth senior brother's facial muscles twitched slightly. It was obvious that the figure's words had poked his sore spot. However, he took a deep breath and suppressed the displeasure in his heart. He said, "Whether he will or not, we can only rely on the facts. As long as you investigate the cultivators who have recently ascended, you'll be able to know whether they ascended or killed themselves. I think there shouldn't be too many cultivators who have recently ascended, so it shouldn't be too difficult to investigate." The figure fell into silence. Obviously, he had tacitly agreed to the fourth senior brother's suggestion. However, it was obvious that he had some concerns. Although he did not object to the fourth senior brother's suggestion, he did not take action immediately. Instead, he stood there quietly as if he was hesitating about something or waiting for something. The fourth senior brother naturally knew what the figure was hesitating about and waiting for. The existence of Luo Fan was a nightmare for him, a nightmare that he dared not provoke or provoke. For the figure in front of him, it was not much different. Even if the figure was at the 5th level of the road to Tao Master to investigate the existence of Luo Fan and sense whether he had ascended or not. If he did not exist, it would be fine. At most, it would be useless. However, if the other party had already ascended to the 5th level and his detection could find him, then his actions were obviously provoking the other party. At that time, if the figure was unhappy and came to deal with him, what awaited him would be the same tragic fate as the fourth senior brother, or even worse. Under such circumstances, even if the figure was very decisive, he had to hesitate. After a while, the figure gritted his teeth and said, "I just hope that his temper is not too bad." As he spoke, his figure slowly dissipated, gradually turning into a rolling cloud. From the looks of it, it was clear that his will had returned to the 5th level, and he had completely severed himself from this formation. The fourth senior brother heaved a sigh of relief when he saw this. "I just hope that I can't find him there," he thought in his heart, with an inexplicable expectation in his eyes. If he could not find Luo Fan in the 5th level, it meant that there was a great possibility that Luo Fan had killed himself. For him, who had been trembling under the shadow of Luo Fan for so long, this was a great thing. At least, his action of breaking free from the previous seal would eliminate all future troubles. The waiting time was longer than he had imagined. Originally, with the strength of the figure, if he wanted to investigate all the new ascenders in the entire 5th level, it would be more than enough for him to do so in 1 to 4 hours. However, this time, the 4th senior brother waited for half a year. During this half a year, there was a cloud of smoke inside the formation in front of him. It was constantly twisting and changing, but it did not change into the appearance of the figure, nor did it give the 4th senior brother the result of his investigation. Although the 4th senior brother was very patient, he could not help but feel a little annoyed. It was not a matter of the length of time, but the difference in the time. It should have been done in 1 to 4 hours, but it took more than half a year, which was a little unusual. The 4th senior brother even began to doubt whether Luo Fan had really ascended, and that person's method of investigation had angered Luo Fan, causing Luo Fan to directly erase it. All kinds of complicated thoughts kept emerging in his heart, causing the 4th senior brother's aura to become slightly chaotic. In the distance, those disciples of the Tao Master or rogue cultivators who wanted to talk to the 4th senior brother naturally gave up the idea of talking to him when they saw his aura, so they gave the 4th senior brother a rare moment of peace. Finally, at a certain moment after half a year, the formation in front of the 4th senior brother began to shake, and the cloud and mist in it began to gradually condense. In the blink of an eye, a vague figure appeared again. This silhouette was none other than the silhouette from back then. Seeing this familiar figure, the 4th senior brother was slightly relieved and asked, "How is it? Has he already ascended?" "I've investigated all the cultivators who have ascended in the past 100 billion years, and none of them is that figure," the figure said with an unconcealable surprise in his words, as if the matter in front of him was far beyond his understanding. Hearing this, the 4th senior brother already understood why the investigation process, which should have been completed in 1 to 4 hours, was delayed to half a year. The period of 100 billion years was indeed within the scope of the latest period in their overall cultivation history. However, compared to the cultivators who had recently ascended, it was obviously a long time. The longer an ascender had ascended, the more difficult it would be to distinguish them. After spending so much time investigating all the cultivators who had ascended in the past 100 billion years, it was actually very efficient for the person to finish the investigation in just half a year. Chapter 2309. Before this, the 4th senior brother had been expecting Luo Fan to destroy himself instead of ascending. Because if he destroyed himself, no matter what he did, Luo Fan would never come back to make trouble for him. Originally, the hidden dangers that would inevitably appear when he broke through the seal would naturally disappear. And if he ascended, it seemed that he had been isolated from the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. But after all, it was just a kind of barrier. If Luo Fan really wanted to pass his power back and punish him directly through various means, he would have thousands of methods in his mind. Not to mention, the other party was even more powerful. That was to say, only if Luo Fan really destroyed himself could he be sure that there would be no future trouble for him. However, at this time, when he confirmed through the figure that Luo Fan really did not enter the 5th level of the Tao Master's path, he found that his mind did not relax because of this. On the contrary, there was a stronger sense of uneasiness. A feeling that he had overlooked something and that he was making a big mistake emerged from the bottom of his heart at this time, which made his mood even heavier. Obviously, the figure projected in the formation was not relaxed at this time. Instead, it seemed to be in a very intense psychological struggle. After a while, he asked, "What on earth did you say to him?" The 4th senior brother was not surprised that the figure had guessed what he had said to Luo Fan. After all, he knew the divine sense of the figure in front of him very well, so he would not be surprised even if the figure did something incredible. Now, through some deductions, he knew that the figure had said something special to Luo Fan, so he was not surprised at all. On the contrary, if he were to be surprised, he would not be surprised that the other party knew what he had said to Luo Fan. Instead, he should be surprised that the other party did not know the content of the conversation between him and Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, he looked extremely calm and just said, "Have you thought about it? Do you really want to know?" Hearing this, the figure was slightly stunned. After a long time, he sighed and said, "Forget it. I don't think I can match up to that person. Even he might perish because of this. I don't think I have 100% chance of surviving." As he spoke, the figure in the formation trembled slightly and gradually collapsed. However, this time, it did not collapse into the form of a cloud like before. Instead, it became fainter and thinner as it collapsed. In the end, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. Seeing this, the fourth senior brother sighed. He was not surprised by the figure's decision. However, he still felt a little disdain in his heart. This kind of disdain was something that he would never have shown in the past. In the past, the concept of hierarchy among the disciples of the Tao Master had long been deeply rooted in the core of his heart. He was absolutely in awe of the higher-ups. Even if he saw or heard something that did not conform to his values, he would try his best to think in a positive way. But now, after his heart had been reconstructed, the concept of hierarchy that was deeply embedded in the core of his heart had long been shattered. For him now, even the Tao Master was no longer so high and mighty. Let alone this kind of cultivator who was only at the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. With a heavy heart, the fourth senior brother turned his head to look at the 4th level, which seemed to be stagnant these days. He shook his head and waved away all kinds of inexplicable uneasiness in his heart. He turned around and went to several disciples of the Tao Master whom he was close to. There was no other way for him to solve the matter that made him feel heavy now. He could only put it aside and wait for the opportunity to solve it in the future. In contrast, the situation of the 4th level of the road to Tao Master was more important. As for why he went to the Tao Master's side, it was even simpler. Although his heart had been reconstructed, the 4th senior brother was still the 4th senior brother. His identity as the Tao Master's disciple would not change. In this way, when there was a conflict between the Tao Master's disciples and the individual cultivators, he would naturally stand on the side of the Tao Master's disciples. With the addition of the 4th senior brother, the strength of the Tao Master's disciples was greatly enhanced. The situation that needed to be stabilized for a while was instantly broken. Friction began to occur quickly and the war began to break out fiercely. In just a few years, the entire 4th level of the road to Tao Master was plunged into a shocking war. There were killings everywhere, flames of war everywhere, and terrifying chaotic forces were everywhere. Both the Tao Master's disciples and the individual cultivators began to leave in large numbers during this process. Some died, some entered the Tao Master's prison, and some directly ascended. In short, they could not stay on the 4th level of the road to Tao Master. In this chaos, a new order began to gradually establish. Although the strength of the Tao Master's disciples was much stronger than that of the individual cultivators, there was still a large gap between them. Therefore, in such a battle, neither side could suppress the other. In the end, the entire 4th level of the road to Tao Master was divided into 2 irregular parts. The Tao Master's disciples occupied half of the area, while the individual cultivators occupied the other half. In between the 2 areas, countless worlds, and spacetime piled up to form a huge Milky Way, separating the 2 areas, so that both sides could go their own way and develop separately. Of course, at the edge of the huge Milky Way, there were a large number of cultivators stationed on either side. These cultivators had moved their own world clusters to this position through various means to defend against the attacks of the cultivators on the other side of the Milky Way. At the same time, they were constantly looking for the opponent's weakness, planning to attack it. This caused the situation to fall into a dynamic state of balance. The pressure promoted development. In this kind of war, because the Tao Master's disciples had a leader like the fourth senior brother, they had the upper hand at the beginning and almost wiped out the individual cultivators. Therefore, in order to fight against the Tao Master's disciples, the individual cultivators gradually formed an alliance and promoted the strongest leader to integrate all their strength, so that they could fight against the Tao Master's disciples with the fourth senior brother. At this time, the fourth senior brother and the leader of the individual cultivators were facing each other across the Milky Way. Near them, many world clusters were like stars surrounding the moon, surrounding and protecting them. From this, it could be seen that the war promoted cultivation. In the past, if there was no war, it would be extremely difficult for those cultivators to move their own world clusters. It could even be said that it would take hundreds of millions of years for them to be able to move their world clusters from a certain location to the edge of the Milky Way. However, due to the pressure of the war, all the individual cultivators under the Tao Master's disciples worked together, mobilized their wisdom, and through countless experiments, they finally managed to quickly move the world clusters from various places to the edge of the Milky Way. However, it was obvious that both sides did not care too much about this. Now, what they cared about was their opponent. The fourth level of the Tao Master's path had fallen into a war because of Luo Fan's departure. On the other side, Luo Fan was completely unaware of this, nor did he care about it. At this moment, he had already fallen into his sixth major tribulation. In the boundless chaos, under the protection of the light of heaven and earth, he struggled to resist the invasion of the endless chaos from the outside. The light of heaven and earth had a certain blocking effect on the invasion of the endless chaos from the outside world, but it was obviously not very effective. At this moment, the protective circle of the light of heaven and earth was gradually retreating under the terrifying pressure from the outside world. In the beginning, it could only cover a radius of a few dozen feet, but now it was even close to his body, leaving him with little room to move. In the face of such pressure, Luo Fan frowned slightly. With the experience of the previous 5 great tribulations, he knew very well that what he was experiencing now was only the precursor of the Great Tribulation. It could not even be considered a legendary warm-up. The real Great Tribulation, the real attack, was still outside. Now he could barely use the power of the light of heaven and earth to resist the pressure of the chaos from the outside world, but it did not mean that he had already withstood the 6th major tribulation. It's just a precursor, but the light of heaven and earth is almost unable to withstand it. How terrifying will the real tribulation be next? Such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. At this moment, the surrounding turbidity began to churn. Wisps of murderous aura gradually separated from the churning, and as if they were attracted by something, they began to quickly gather towards Luo Fan from all directions. The protection of the light of heaven and earth began to be cleansed at this moment, trying its best to eliminate the murderous aura so that it could not really come into contact with Luo Fan's body. However, it was a pity that the murderous aura seemed to be changing under the control of an even more incredible will. Even though the light of heaven and earth underwent countless changes due to the murderous aura, it could only watch helplessly as the murderous aura swept away the protection of the light of heaven and earth, and approached Luo Fan's body bit by bit. In the face of this change, the sense of crisis in the bottom of Luo Fan's heart became even more intense. With a slight thought, his unique worldview was stimulated. A strong light that belonged to the worldview emerged from the depths of his body, penetrated countless obstacles, and turned into the light of heaven and earth. It condensed towards the wisps of murderous aura from various angles and at various speeds, frantically crushing the murderous aura and trying its best to cut off the murderous aura. However, It was a pity that the murderous aura had a much easier time dealing with the light emitted by his worldview than dealing with the power of the light of heaven and earth. In order to deal with the power of the light of heaven and earth, the threads condensed by the murderous aura had to produce countless inexplicable tremors and undergo some subtle, complex, and unimaginable distortions in the power. However, in the face of the light emitted by the worldview that Luo Fan had released at this moment, the threads of murderous aura didn't move at all. It was as if they had directly ignored the light and crashed straight into it. At this moment, Luo Fan clearly felt that his light was constantly trembling under the impact of the silk threads. Bits and pieces of light fragments were constantly flying in all directions, as if they had turned into a strange mist, and began to gradually turn invisible. It felt like an ordinary person had suddenly grabbed an electric drill with his hand. Chi. The threads of murderous aura simply surpassed time. When Luo Fan felt this strange feeling, they had already wrapped around his body and formed a strange cocoon of murderous aura in the blink of an eye. Along with this change, the light of heaven and earth above Luo Fan's head suddenly seemed to be under some kind of incredible pull and began to rapidly sink. In the blink of an eye, it had already passed through the cocoon of murderous aura and reintegrated into Luo Fan's body. In an extremely strange way, it had intertwined with his mind and body, forming some kind of mysterious protection for him. At the same time, the existence that Luo Fan corresponded to in the other layers also encountered a similar change. The endless existence that corresponded to the Great Tribulation began to split off a strange power that continuously drilled into the existence that corresponded to him. In the blink of an eye, the existence that corresponded to him had already fallen into a strange state that couldn't be described with words. At the same time, the existence that corresponded to the light of heaven and earth also fused with the existence that corresponded to him and began to resist the existence that corresponded to the Great Tribulation in a state that was between passive and active. In the end, I still can't avoid it. At this moment, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The previous omen was just the brewing of the Great Tribulation. There was no meaning in blocking it at all. When the Great Tribulation finished brewing and was about to attack him, no matter how exquisite and tight his defenses were, he wouldn't be able to withstand it. After all, he was at most a cultivator that had just triggered the sixth Great Tribulation, while his opponent was in a state of chaos, or perhaps even more vast and mysterious existences behind the chaos. No matter how heaven-defying his strength was, it was impossible for him to be so heaven-defying that he could completely ignore its power, right? As the cocoon formed by the endless baleful aura wrapped around Luo Fan, the surrounding turbid chaos began to rapidly evolve. Endless baleful aura began to seep out and enter the cocoon, causing it to become larger and larger, and the encirclement to become tighter and tighter. Chapter 23:10. As the baleful aura formed a cocoon, it replaced the originally endless turbidity and chaos, and the characteristics hidden within the baleful aura were gradually revealed. The baleful aura was not just a simple power of a certain nature. It was an existence that encompassed time, space, matter, energy, and even all the profound existences that could or could not be imagined by any other living being. If one was enveloped by this baleful aura, it would be impossible to break through it no matter how powerful one's power was. Only by matching its characteristics and attacking and affecting the baleful aura cocoon in a way that it could accept could one break through the baleful aura cocoon and escape. At this moment, countless indescribable existences flowed endlessly within the huge baleful aura cocoon. They gradually disintegrated Luo Fan's body and separated everything that existed within it. Even his life source, which was limited by his worldview, gradually disintegrated during this process and unknowingly fused with the baleful aura cocoon. In other words, Luo Fan had only been enveloped by the baleful aura cocoon for a short while before he completely disappeared. Only the extremely pure and strange baleful aura was left in its place. Correspondingly, similar changes also occurred on many other levels. The existences that corresponded to the baleful aura cocoon had completely separated the existences that corresponded to Luo Fan and fused with the existences that corresponded to the baleful aura cocoon. In the end, they could no longer be found, and not even the slightest trace of them was revealed. This seemed to indicate that Luo Fan had failed his tribulation, but it did not cause the baleful aura cocoon to stop changing. On the contrary, the baleful aura cocoon revolved more and more intensely, becoming more and more violent. It was as if it had suddenly developed some sort of powerful resistance. At this moment, Luo Fan had already fallen into a daze. He felt as if his body had been split into billions of parts in an instant. Every part was protected by a supreme existence as it floated in the boundless darkness. That incomparably huge existence gave him a sufficient sense of security. Even though his body was still disintegrating, and it felt as though there was an unimaginably terrifying destruction floating above him that was about to descend and crush him at any moment, he still felt an inexplicable sense of security, after an unknown amount of time, which felt like billions of trillions of years. Luo Fan gradually woke up from his daze. When he broke free, he realized what had happened just now. His body had indeed been dismembered into billions of parts. As for him, he was indeed being protected by some sort of unparalleled existence. It was none other than the light of heaven and earth, which he had also broken down into billions of parts. In fact, if one were to only talk about the light of heaven and earth that enveloped every single part of him, the light of heaven and earth that enveloped his many fragments were only about the same size as those fragments. No matter how one looked at it, it was not unparalleled. However, it was the light of heaven and earth, and not some other power. For an existence like this, there was not much difference between breaking down and merging. Even if it seemed like it had been broken down into billions of parts, it was still just a form. In fact, on a deeper level, it was still complete. It was still a perfect whole. The light of heaven and earth that every fragment of Luo Fan sensed was still the complete light of heaven and earth. In this way, the light of heaven and earth that every fragment of Luo Fan sensed was naturally billions of times larger than itself. No matter from which angle one looked at it, this could already be considered to be incomparably huge. It's actually like this. In this case, if I didn't have the protection of the light of heaven and earth, I probably wouldn't even know that I had broken down into countless fragments. This thought appeared in Luo Fan's many fragments. Because he had been in a daze before, the process of him being broken down into countless fragments was completely blurry to him, and he could not clearly distinguish it. Under such circumstances, if there was no guidance from the light of heaven and earth, given that his many fragments were in a relatively independent state, each fragment would definitely think that he was the real Luo Fan. They might even think that his current weak state was a natural reaction to the tribulation, just like the previous great tribulations, when that time came, when they grew and strengthened on their own, and even when they finally regained their complete cultivation, what awaited him would probably be a slaughter and mutual annihilation. Moreover, the final victor would not be him, but an existence that grew from one of his clones, an existence that looked exactly the same as him, but had a completely different nature. When he thought of this, even Luo Fan could not help but feel a chill down his spine. Fortunately, he had the light of heaven and earth to maintain the connection between the countless fragments, and to communicate with the thoughts and information of the countless fragments. He was still connected as a whole, thus avoiding this danger. However, this was as far as the light of heaven and earth could go. After all, to the world's will within the light of heaven and earth, there was not much difference between Luo Fan's current appearance and his original flawless appearance. Naturally, it could not use its own power to reform the countless fragments of Luo Fan into a whole. Moreover, although the boundless darkness around him was not enough to completely cut off the light of heaven and earth, it was enough to isolate most of Luo Fan's senses. Although he knew the existence of the other fragments, his deep connection with them still existed. However, in the end, he could no longer determine the location of the other fragment. If he could not even determine their location, how could he combine with the other fragments into a whole? At this moment, a ray of light started to appear in the boundless darkness. This ray of light appeared in front of the countless fragments at the same time, causing every fragment to face this ray of light directly. It felt as if only he and this ray of light existed in the boundless darkness. After this ray of light appeared, it started to rapidly rush towards every fragment of Luo Fan. Wherever this ray of light passed, the void evolved. Time, space, matter, and energy naturally appeared and started to spread out rapidly. They rapidly spread into the boundless darkness and gradually changed the nature of the boundless darkness. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into different worlds that appeared around the fragments. In other words, the moment the ray of light collided with the fragments, every fragment of Luo Fan had already been swallowed into an indescribable world. His body had been split into trillions of parts, and these worlds were naturally also trillions of square meters. And each of these trillions of square meters had its own characteristic. Each world had a completely different characteristic from the other trillions of square meters. Looking at the trillions of square meters, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. Every time he entered the Great Calamity, he felt that his worldview was being overturned. Originally, for cultivators, opening up a perfect world would require them to pay a huge price. However, in this place, it was almost like a small kiliocosm that could casually create trillions of square meters. In fact, in the outside world, a perfect world could only be sublimated after going through many great calamities. However, in this great calamity, it could be casually born and created. All of this could be said to have overturned his understanding of the world and of chaos time and time again. Just like what was happening in front of him, the level of these trillions of square meters had at least surpassed the level of a perfect world. As for whether or not they had reached the level of a great world, his fragments were too weak, and he had only been in these worlds for a short time, so he could not tell. Fortunately, Luo Fan's worldview was extremely tough. Otherwise, just the impact alone would have been enough to make his Tao foundation collapse, and he would have lost without a fight. With a thought, each of his fragments began to look in the direction where the light had left his body. At this moment, the light had already disappeared into the horizon behind each of his fragments. With another flash, it had completely disappeared, as if the light had never existed. Different worlds had different characteristics. If all the characteristics were put together, they might even be completely opposite. Just appearing at the same time could cause an extremely intense conflict, or even annihilate each other. At this moment, the power that Luo Fan's countless fragments retained was only equivalent to the level of a newly itinerant immortal. Compared to his original self, he naturally couldn't be considered as an ant even if he wanted to. However, no matter what, he could no longer be considered as a powerless mortal. Coupled with his complete control of his will and the support of his endless cultivation memories, it was enough for these fragments, which were only equivalent to the power of an itinerant immortal, to display the power of a quasi-sage. At this moment, no matter how harsh the environment around the fragments was, they could still use their various methods to isolate themselves from the harsh environment and gradually stabilize in those worlds. Although these newly appeared worlds were different from each other, they all had one thing in common among the countless worlds. That was, these worlds were all newly formed. In other words, Luo Fan's fragment could almost be considered the first person since the birth of this world. At a glance, the entire world was filled with a wild and primitive aura. Although there was endless vitality brewing, no living beings had been born. At a certain place where the fragments were, Luo Fan's fragment looked around. It was surrounded by boundless land. With his current perception and eyesight, he couldn't see the boundaries of this land at all. He didn't know whether this land was the entirety of this world or just a small part of it, and there was an even vaster ocean beyond it. At this moment, his fragment was like a speck of dust that did not have any form at all. In fact, if one's eyesight and perception did not reach a certain level, it would be impossible for them to discover his existence. With a slight thought, a black hole appeared in the fragment's body and began to frantically absorb the endless vitality around it. As the vitality surged in, the fragment began to grow rapidly. In a short while, it had already transformed into a strange appearance. One of them had a humanoid silhouette, but it had 3 eyes and 2 elbow joints on its arms. It looked like it was a third longer than its original size. Is this the born Taoism body of this world? Could it be that this world wasn't created out of thin air, but instead has a template? Luo Fan's fragment could not help but mutter to itself as it looked at this body. It had to be known that the body he had derived from the fragment relied on his body's compatibility with the world, absorbing the laws deep within the world around him to derive a body. After this body was formed, it was most compatible with the rules of this world, and was most suitable for cultivating in this world. In other words, it was actually the appearance of the born Taoism body of this world. Originally, if it had been born out of thin air, without any template, and was just a random world created by the great catastrophe, the appearance of this body should have been compatible with Luo Fan's perception of himself. In other words, it should have been compatible with Luo Fan's original appearance. After all, if the great catastrophe had been born naturally, the world would not have had a creator, and there would not have been a template for the born Taoism body. Of course, it could have looked like anything. Combined with Luo Fan's own perception of himself, it would naturally automatically transform into the humanoid-born Taoism body that Luo Fan was most familiar with. Clearly, the development of the situation in front of him was not what he had expected, and he could not help but have this speculation. At the same time, in the countless worlds, countless trillions of Luo Fan's fragments took similar actions at the same time. They began to absorb the qi of the world, and began to reconstruct their bodies in the most compatible state with the world. In the end, his countless fragments transformed into trillions of forms that Luo Fan did not even dare to think about in the past. All of them looked extremely strange, and some of them were even completely incompatible with his sense of beauty. These were none other than the different born Taoism bodies that existed in the trillions of worlds. Feeling the countless fragments that were derived from the innate Taoism body, which was different from the innate Taoism body that he knew, but all of them seemed to be harmonious, revealing an indescribably mysterious body. Luo Fan finally confirmed his previous guess. These worlds were definitely not created out of thin air. Instead, they were replicated using some other worlds as a template. Chapter 23:11. Even though the templates of these countless worlds were just perfect worlds, there were so many worlds that represented billions of perfect worlds. This had even surpassed the number of perfect worlds that Luo Fan had seen through various means. It could be said that as long as Luo Fan understood the world that existed in each of his fragments, it would be equivalent to having a deep understanding of the billions of perfect worlds that existed in the primal chaos state, or even the billions of perfect worlds that existed in the past. The best reading experience of a novel. How could Luo Fan not be shocked? A fragment with 3 eyes and 4 elbows flew up at this moment and headed for the place where the changes in this world were the most intense. As a newly formed world, this world was still in a state of evolution. The place where the changes were the most intense was the place where the characteristics of the state of evolution were displayed most vividly. For Luo Fan's fragment that had fallen into this world, regardless of whether it wanted to break through the shackles placed on it by this world, accomplish something in this world, or just survive in this world, it was necessary to understand this world. And the best position to understand this world was obviously the position of his current target. The power of this fragment was only at the level of an individual immortal, but the strength that it could exert was close to the level of a sage to be. This kind of strength was already considered powerful enough in this world that had just been born. It was only a matter of time before they headed to any of their targets. Not long after, the fragment with 3 eyes and 4 elbows arrived in front of a deep pool in the center of this world. At first glance, this deep pool seemed to be calm and without any ripples, as if it was just an ordinary deep pool filled with ordinary pool water. However, as long as one took a closer look, one would find that this deep pool was not ordinary at all. Although it was pool water, it was not ordinary pool water. Instead, it was a kind of strange essence water that contained infinite mysterious power. At this moment, the mysterious power was constantly combining with this perfect world, causing all kinds of indescribable changes to the surrounding space, time, matter, and energy. During these changes, although the surface of the deep pool did not change, the inside of it was constantly expanding. Due to the change of time, there was even a faint barrier between the inside and the outside, allowing the inside of the deep pool to obtain a certain degree of independence. It could be said that the inside of the deep pool was almost like a miniature world that contained the essence of this perfect world. With a slight thought, the third eye of Luo Fan's fragment began to emit an inexplicable light. The light rushed out and directly penetrated into the deep pool, communicating with the infinite mysterious power that existed in the deep pool. Following this, an endless amount of mysterious energy was transmitted to his third eye through the light. It seeped into it and caused his third eye to gradually change. The third eye, which was originally no different from the other 2 eyes, became stronger and stronger as it changed. The power contained within it also became more and more powerful. At a certain moment, the eye trembled slightly and directly froze. Then, it quickly melted and turned into an eye tattoo that appeared on his forehead. As it turned into a tattoo, wisps of power continued to spread from his body in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already engulfed his entire body. As this power spread around his body, countless information and comprehension appeared out of nowhere in his heart. The power of his fragment began to increase continuously, and the various comprehensions that were originally deeply rooted but not very suitable for this perfect world also began to be adjusted subtly. In this way, from the outside, it seemed that his cultivation realm, which was originally limited to the itinerant immortal realm, began to increase rapidly. In a breath's time, he had already broken through the 3 earthly immortal realms and stepped into the primordial pure yang realm. Then, he even brazenly crossed the 3 primordial pure yang realms and broke into the innate zenith heaven realm. In this way, the realm barriers in front of him seemed to be made of paper. They did not pose any obstruction to him at all as he broke through them one by one, causing his cultivation realm to reach the pseudo-saint realm. At this moment, he felt that his body and mind were resonating with a certain world. Under this resonance, he seemed to be able to obtain endless power from that world. He could borrow the power of that world to become omniscient, and omnipotent. At this moment, that world was continuously expanding and strengthening, gradually fusing with an even vaster world. Gradually, the resonance between him and this world shifted to that vaster, more powerful, and more unbelievable world. After a slight daze, Luo Fan already understood what was going on. Right now, what resonated with him was none other than the relatively independent world that was formed inside the deep pool in front of him. In other words, the pseudo-saint that he had become was actually only achieved because of that world. It was a pseudo-saint that could only be effective in that world. Next, he could only become the pseudo-saint of this world when that world had truly merged with the outside world. Only then would he be able to become the pseudo-saint of this world. Only then would he be able to be omniscient, and omnipotent in this world, as if he was in his own world. This was a benefit, but at the same time it was also a shackle. The benefit was that he could quickly understand everything about this world. Very quickly, he would be able to understand all the mysteries hidden behind this world. The downside was that the shackles between his fragment and this world would be even stronger. The shackles of this world would also make him stronger. If he needed to break the shackles of this perfect world, the difficulty would be even higher than before. This was a matter of course. After all, he was now using the power of this world to become a pseudo-saint. His foundation could be said to have been transferred to this world. In this way, his connection with this world would naturally be even closer. It would be even more difficult for him to break free from the shackles, but it was only natural. With regards to this, Luo Fan's heart only flashed for a moment before he understood. With a thought, he turned to the other fragments and discovered that among the countless trillions of fragments, most of them had obtained the benefits bestowed by the world due to his fragments' research on the world. Their cultivation realm had increased crazily. At the very least, they had raised their cultivation to the level of a quasi-saint. The most had even raised their cultivation to the level of a supreme emperor. It could be said that in just a short while, the connection between his fragments and the heavens and earth had been greatly strengthened. Sensing this scene, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. He wasn't surprised that such a thing had happened. And this could not even be said to be the great calamity that was targeting him, because this could be said to be the result of the evolution of the world's laws. After all, although Luo Fan had been split into countless fragments, his consciousness was still complete. It was still fused into one with the help of the light of the world. Under such circumstances, what he carried on each fragment was actually the projection of his complete consciousness. Luo Fan was currently undergoing the sixth great calamity. From a certain perspective, his understanding of cultivation, the essence of cultivation that he had grasped, the power that he understood, the world that he understood, space-time that he understood, and even the chaos that he understood could be considered as infinite power. In this way, his fragments would naturally obtain the affinity of the world when they were in the world. His unintentional actions would involuntarily conform to some sort of deep rule of the world, and then it would draw the power of the world into him, constantly elevating his realm and his power to a level that was compatible with his knowledge. From the looks of it, no matter what his shards did, they would easily be acknowledged by the world, and then be bestowed upon by the world, elevating their cultivation level to a height unimaginable for normal living beings. At this moment, the fragment with 3 eyes and 4 elbows let out a soft cry and directly dove into the deep pool. The deep pool looked normal from the outside, but there was an invisible barrier around it that blocked everything, or rather, it isolated the inside from the outside. If ordinary things or even living beings that had just been born in the world collided with the barrier, they would definitely not be able to enter the range of the deep pool. They would definitely be bounced back immediately and might even directly pass through the deep pool and go to the other side of the deep pool. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan's fragment was completely different. He had already become a false sage with the world inside the deep pool as his foundation. To him, entering the deep pool was like returning home. The outer barrier naturally could not affect him. In a flash, he arrived in the deep pool and entered the world that had taken the initiative to become his foundation. This world was a boundless world of water. The entire world was covered in blue water. At a glance, it was just a surging and expanding ocean. The giant looked over. The sky was infinitely high, and he could not see what was behind the sky with his naked eye. Only by using his authority as the false sage of this world could he sense that there was a barrier at a certain height in the sky, a barrier that was the end of this world. With a thought, the fragment with 3 eyes and 4 elbows raised his hand and waved. An extremely mysterious force appeared in front of him and condensed into a ball of light the size of a thumb in front of him, emitting an aura that was extremely amiable to him. This small ball of light continued to grow at this moment. In just a few breaths, it had grown from the size of a thumb to the size of an adult's fist. In another few breaths, it had grown to the size of a soccer ball. This ball of light was none other than the mysterious force that was constantly being released from the deep pool at this moment. It was combining with time, space, matter, and energy in the outside world and continuously changing them. This was because the fragment of Luo Fan had already become the false sage of this world. It could be said that it had already grasped everything in this world. Naturally, it was equivalent to grasping this mysterious force. At that moment, with just a slight thought, the mysterious power poured countless pieces of information into his heart, gradually fusing with his memories. Through understanding this information, he understood in the blink of an eye what the essence of this mysterious force was. This mysterious force was nothing else. In fact, it was a type of power that was derived from the wisp of power left behind by the true sage who created the world and combined with the state of chaos. In other words, it was a type of power that was degenerated from the wisp of power of the true sage after combining with the state of chaos. This kind of power possessed endless transformations and boundless might. Now it had fused with the perfect world, changing time, space, matter, and energy, forming this almost independent little world. However, this was just the most ordinary, and most basic transformation of this power. The true use of this power was that it contained all the laws of the perfect world and even the mysteries of the great Tao. It was no wonder that the fragment of Luo Fan was able to break through from the itinerant immortal stage to the false sage stage with just the infusion of this mysterious force. This mysterious energy contained the profundities of all the laws of this perfect world, as well as the profundities of all the grand Taos. If he truly comprehended it completely, it might be a little exaggerated for him to directly become a true sage, but it would definitely not be a problem for him to push his cultivation realm to the level of passing through 2 or 3 major tribulations. From this aspect, he only became a false sage after receiving the infusion of this mysterious force. In fact, he was not even an independent false sage who was not bound by the shackles of heaven and earth. This could be said to be a great waste of the mysteries of this mysterious force. However, it was not too late for him to realize this. After all, that power might only be an insignificant wisp to the true sage who created this perfect world. However, to him, this power was already so huge that it was terrifying enough to fill the world. Even though he had wasted some of it just now, there was still an endless amount of this mysterious force in this deep pool. If he wanted to, he could comprehend the mysteries of this mysterious force again at any time. Similarly, he could raise his cultivation realm at any time. Chapter 23:12. The fragment with 3 eyes and 4 elbows continuously comprehended the various profound mysteries contained in that wisp of power, and Luo Fan's cultivation realm rose bit by bit. After all, he was already a powerhouse who was going through the 6th major tribulation, so the comprehension of the false saint realm was not much of a secret to him. Now, the thing that shackled his cultivation realm was the power grasped by this fragment, as well as the difference between his own comprehension and this world. Under such circumstances, he had obtained this wisp of power and comprehended the various principles and information that the true saint who had created this world had grasped within this wisp of power. To him, this was making up for what he lacked and eliminating the difference between his comprehension and that of this world. As this difference disappeared, the endless power around him naturally began to gather on his body. As they fused together, it naturally pushed his cultivation realm upwards. The false saint he had just achieved was a false saint that was shackled by this world. However, as his cultivation realm increased, he gradually gained the ability to break free from the shackles of this world. Although he felt that his connection with this world was getting closer and closer, he faintly felt that he could break free from the shackles of this world. If it was an ordinary false saint, it would be difficult for them to grasp this feeling, and they might not even be able to understand it. However, for Luo Fan, this was a state he had already experienced once. However, the moment this feeling appeared, He had already grasped onto it and began to break through the shackles he had encountered bit by bit as he worked hard. His body gradually emitted an inexplicable light. This kind of light was like a flame, enveloping his body and burning the surrounding void. During this process, the ball of light that flowed out of the deep pool and gathered in his hand also continued to grow. After a few dozen breaths, Luo Fan's fragment had turned into a sun-like shape under the illumination of the light, quietly hanging above the deep pool. As for the ball of light in front of him, it was like another sun, shining together with him and emitting endless light and heat, enveloping the entire deep pool. In other words, this was a boundless ocean in his eyes. This perfect world began to tremble slightly at this moment. This tremor even penetrated the barrier of this small world, and was transmitted to this world. For any perfect world, the experts that appeared at the beginning of the world all had a special meaning. Everything that happened to such a powerhouse could ultimately lead to a change in the direction of the world's development. In fact, it could even determine some of the rules of this world in the future. Under such circumstances, the fragment of Luo Fan had already begun to break through the shackles of the false saint realm and began to climb to a higher height before living beings were born in this world. How could this not trigger a reaction from this world? In a trance, Luo Fan felt as if there was an invisible eye above his head, staring at him with an extremely strange gaze. This eye was invisible and intangible. No matter what kind of perception one used, it was impossible to discover its exact appearance. Only through this kind of intuition could one know that such an eye existed. At this moment, Luo Fan understood that this was the gaze of the newly born heaven and earth will. This kind of heaven and earth will was extremely different from the heaven and earth will after the world was truly perfected in the future. Compared to the future, the current heaven and earth will seem to have an additional coldness that should not have originally. There was already a huge difference between the heaven and earth will and the will of living beings. This made it impossible for ordinary living beings to understand the thoughts of the heaven and earth will, and it was impossible for them to understand any reactions from the heaven and earth will. However, at this moment, the gaze of the heaven and earth will that appeared in Luo Fan's intuition made him feel extremely uncomfortable compared to the heaven and earth will that he understood in the past. Or, to be more precise, it lacked something that he had sensed before that all the heaven and earth wills had. What exactly is it? Even though he was breaking through, Luo Fan could not help but have this thought. With a soft sound, his body suddenly relaxed. At this moment, he knew that he had broken through the shackles of this small world. After breaking through this shackle, he was still a false saint, but he was no longer just a false saint in this small world. Instead, he had become a false saint in any position, be it in this small world or the perfect world outside. Of course, although he had broken through the shackle, it also meant that his omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient ability had been restricted to some extent. After all, if there were really no restrictions and he could have such omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient abilities in any position, then he would not be a false saint, but an existence of a higher level. As for where this restriction was, it could not be described with words. At this moment, Luo Fan wanted to enjoy the feeling of breaking through the shackles. All of a sudden, he felt an extremely strong sense of danger shrouding his body. This sense of danger was so strong that it even made him instinctively activate all his power to protect himself, together with the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, countless terrifying powers suddenly appeared in his body out of thin air. They erupted in an instant and directly tore his body into pieces. This fragment, which was originally only one of the billions of fragments, once again collapsed into billions of fragments. Why would the will of heaven and earth attack me? Luo Fan was filled with doubts. Although this encounter was sudden, he knew very well that other than the will of heaven and earth that was watching him just now, it could not be any other existence that could do this in this perfect world. However, it was precisely because he knew this that he was even more confused. This was because he could not find the motive for the will of heaven and earth to attack him at all. Although he was the first false saint to become free in this world, he was still a false saint after all. Compared to the will of heaven and earth, he was still very far away. Any consequences he caused were absolutely insignificant to the will of heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, the will of the heavens and earth shouldn't have attacked him directly. Just as he was feeling puzzled, the power left behind by the true saint who had created this perfect world and the chaotic state that he had just gathered also began to collapse in front of him. After it collapsed, it directly pounced towards the billions of fragments that Luo Fan's fragments had exploded. Every fragment of power wrapped around every fragment of his. This power was so mysterious that even though Luo Fan had the light of heaven and earth to protect his countless fragments, he could not defend against the corrosion of this power to the fragments. In the blink of an eye, his countless fragments had completely fused with that power. At this moment, a sense of confusion was transmitted from the countless fragments. In a trance, Luo Fan felt that his perception of his own fragment in the world had become faintly discernible. It had even reached the point where he would ignore it if he wasn't careful. In this faint perception, he could only confirm that his fragments had not disappeared. However, he could no longer confirm what had happened to the fragments like before, nor could he receive any feedback from the fragments. This situation made him immediately understand that the will of the perfect world still hadn't relaxed its attention on him. After all, his perception of the fragments was through the light of heaven and earth. In other words, it was through the will of the world that existed within the light of heaven and earth. Now, his perception was greatly restricted, and he could not even successfully connect to the fragments. Naturally, there was only one possibility. That was, the will of the world within the light of heaven and earth was restricted. Obviously, the only thing that could restrict the will of the world was the will of the world itself. Furthermore, it could be deduced that the reason why the countless fragments that had exploded previously were unable to effectively avoid the power left behind by the true sage and the chaotic state was because the will of the heaven and earth within the light of heaven and earth was restricted by the will of the perfect heaven and earth. Otherwise, given the special characteristics of the light of heaven and earth, even if the power was insufficient, it would not be able to bypass its defenses without any resistance. At this moment, apart from the three-eyed, four-armed fragment, the majority of his fragments in the many other worlds encountered a similar situation. For some unknown reason, the will of the heavens and earth directly attacked his will. Although the effects of the attacks were different, they were equally absolute, and he could not avoid them at all. In fact, they even blocked his perception of the fragments. At this moment, Luo Fan naturally understood that this was the true start of the great calamity. Some of his fragments were like the 3 eyes and 4 elbows fragment, comprehending the mysteries of heaven and earth in their own world to improve their cultivation. Some were just feeling the strange sceneries of the heaven and earth, observing the mysterious sceneries that existed in the heaven and earth that did not exist in the heaven and earth he had experienced before. However, regardless of whether it was the fragments that were cultivating to improve their cultivation realm or the fragments that were just looking at the scenery, they were all attacked by the will of the world. Some were broken into countless fragments, some were directly transformed into some kind of strange existence and fused with the world, and some simply disappeared as if they had never existed in the first place. There were all sorts of strange things that could happen to any living being after being attacked. If a fragment was like this, then he would still think that it was the fragment's action that had accidentally violated the taboo of the world. For example, the 3-eyed, 4-armed fragment had previously wondered if it had broken through the shackles of the small world and offended the perfect world, causing the will of the world to punish it. However, it was the same for almost countless worlds. No matter what their fragments were doing, they would be attacked by the will of the world, falling into a state where their senses towards the fragments were almost completely cut off. Clearly, they could not use such an excuse to dodge the attack. After eliminating all the impossibilities, what was left was naturally the only possibility. This was the natural reaction of the perfect world. Or rather, this was one of the reasons why the great calamity had created so many worlds. Knowing this, Luo Fan hurriedly focused his will on the fragments that had not yet been attacked by the will of the world, and observed all the possible changes that would occur to these fragments at this time. Although the attacks from the will of the world against his fragments were not synchronized, they would not only appear after he had entered the world for too long. Right now, it was clearly the time when the will of the world had begun to attack. Therefore, when Luo Fan focused his attention on the fragments, they very quickly began to be attacked by the will of the world. Compared to the sudden attacks from before, he finally discovered some clues with the help of the light of the world. In a perfect world that was completely gaseous, before Luo Fan's fragment that looked like a gaseous life form was attacked, the entire world began to undergo a strange change. The laws of the world, time, space, and even the great Tao all underwent a strange change. This change was produced in the depths of everything. Like flowing water, it flowed through time, space, laws, and the great Tao, and finally gathered together, triggering the will of the world. This caused the will of the world to directly restrict the light of the world in a way that he could not understand. Then, time, space, laws, and the great Tao simultaneously attacked his fragment with their own characteristics. These attacks appeared at the same time and directly surpassed all defenses. His fragment could not resist at all, and it was completely annihilated in an instant. Just as he was about to observe where his fragment went after being annihilated, Luo Fan discovered that his sense of the fragment had also become blurry and indistinct. This kind of feeling only allowed him to confirm that his fragment still existed, and that it hadn't truly perished and been destroyed. However, he could no longer find out where it had gone, or what changes had occurred. It turns out that the will of the world only played a restraining role. The real attack was actually launched by the entire world. At this time, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his eyebrows deeply wrinkled. Chapter 23:13. The strength of the will of the world could not be measured by quantity. In order to measure the strength of the will of the world, there were obviously stricter and more profound standards. At the very least, at this moment, Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth only had a portion of the will of the world. However, the billions of perfect wills of the world could only restrain it, and could not erase the will of the world inside the light of heaven and earth. It was precisely because of this that something like this happened at this very moment. Although there were countless trillions of wills of the world dealing with the light of the world at the same time, the light of the world was still able to maintain its most basic power. It was still able to maintain the integrity of Luo Fan's innumerable fragments, maintaining his thoughts that were still in perfect condition. However, it was clear that no matter how powerful the light of heaven and earth was and how many wondrous uses it had, there was still a limit. The foundation of its existence was still attached to Luo Fan's body. If it really continued to be divided like this, when every fragment was divided into an even larger number of fragments, the light of heaven and earth would eventually be affected. Perhaps by then, it could still maintain the integrity of his mind, but the protection of his mind would probably be greatly affected. For this predictable result, Luo Fan was quite clear in his heart. While his mind was still intact, he tried his best to experience what happened to the fragments that were attacked by the perfect world. In the perfect world where the 3 eyes and 4 elbows fragment was located, the whole world underwent some subtle changes as Luo Fan's fragment collapsed. The perspective of the world's will that had originally appeared in the void had completely disappeared. At first glance, the whole world seemed to have completely returned to its original appearance. However, if one took a closer look, they would discover that the rate at which the world's vitality was surging was at least hundreds of thousands of times faster than before. The first batch of living beings in this world, which originally needed a very long time to brew, was born in almost a few days, breaking the originally desolate atmosphere of the world. After the first batch of living beings appeared, they instinctively absorbed the endless yuan qi around them to strengthen themselves. They had just been born, so their wills were hazy and their spirits were blurry. They didn't even have the ability to think. However, as the first batch of living beings born in the world, they were born with countless wonders. They quickly broke through the haziness and confusion, giving birth to their first wisps of intelligence as living beings. When the first wisp of wisdom was born, the world trembled slightly. Winds blew and clouds surged. All sorts of indescribable phenomena appeared in the void, as if they were celebrating the birth of wisdom. After this intelligence was born, it instinctively began to refine its own body, absorb essence qi, refine essence qi, and fuse essence qi. It increased the efficiency of all of this and increased the benefits it obtained from essence qi. The first sentient being was a strange stream of air. That stream of air was extremely mysterious. Although it was just a stream of air, it was as if it was real. Just the circulation of it was enough to shake the laws of the world, causing them to change according to the way that the stream of air required. As the airflow continued to absorb the origin qi, its shape also began to change. Gradually, the airflow that was changing at will turned into a human figure with 3 eyes and 4 elbows. This was naturally not because the airflow had obtained some sort of inheritance and knew that this form was the most suitable for cultivation. Instead, when it adjusted its shape to test the absorption and use of origin qi, it discovered that this was the only form that could absorb and use origin qi the most efficiently. It also had the strongest affinity with laws. In other words, it was an almost instinctive change that caused it to take on this form. After the creature took on this form, it continued to absorb the endless origin qi. Its figure also became more and more solid and powerful. At a certain moment, the sky was filled with dark clouds. Endless lightning descended from the sky, landing where the creature was, completely drowning it. After a few days, the dark clouds dissipated, and the creature turned into a body of flesh and blood. It had 3 eyes and 4 elbows, and its appearance was extremely similar to the creature that Luo Fan had transformed into in the fragment of the world. This was the first transformation tribulation of this world. This also began the evolution process of the creatures born in this world, and determined the direction of their evolution. At that moment, under the guidance of the aura, countless living beings that were born in countless locations across the world began to trigger the tribulations. They voluntarily endured the baptism of the tribulation thunder and shed their original bodies, obtaining the perfect born Taoism body with 3 eyes and 4 elbows. As the transformation tribulations appeared one after another, the world finally became lively. The many creatures that had just transformed also discovered each other's existence due to the repeated lightning tribulations. They began to connect more, and communication also began to increase. The increase in connection and communication stimulated even more intelligence, allowing the living beings who could only instinctively absorb qi to improve themselves to gradually organize their usage of qi. Gradually, they obtained the most basic cultivation method that the world had been born in the first place, even though it could only be considered a crude one. Luo Fan's will did not let go of this world, either. It also searched the world for the changes that had occurred after its fragment was attacked. However, as the creatures that had evolved in this world continued to grow, he did not gain anything at all. He could not even sense any of its aura, let alone its fragment. In the beginning, he even suspected that its many fragments had been split into the first batch of creatures born in this world. After all, after its fragments had collapsed and disappeared, the vitality of the world had suddenly increased, and the rate at which creatures were born had suddenly sped up. No matter how he looked at it, there was a connection between the two, right? However, no matter how he observed, analyzed, sensed, deduced, probed, and even mobilized the power of the world to dissect the creatures, in the end, he discovered that they were not formed from its fragments. It could even be said that those creatures had nothing to do with him at all. They were completely formed from this perfect world. He was completely baffled by this situation. Fortunately, the evolution speed of those perfect worlds varied, and there were too many fragments that he had split into. It would still take a long time for the world to attack his fragments one after another. This gave him enough time to observe these worlds more carefully and search for the whereabouts of the fragments that he had split into. Otherwise, it would be fatal if he did not gain anything for several years. When Luo Fan had even decided to give up on this world and focus more on other worlds, searching for worlds that were easier to confirm and had more clues, the first cultivation method of this world was born. To be honest, this cultivation method was extremely crude. In Luo Fan's eyes, it was countless times cruder than the first cultivation method that he had created when he had just transmigrated to the primordial world. If this cultivation method was placed in front of him, he felt that even if he was just a mortal, he would not have the motivation to cultivate it. However, after the appearance of such a cultivation method, he suddenly felt a subtle stirring in the depths of his heart. It was as if this cultivation technique had some sort of extremely subtle and mysterious relationship with him. What's going on? Luo Fan could not help but be secretly surprised. One had to know that this was a cultivation method. It was a summary of those cultivators' cultivation method. Moreover, it was an extremely crude summary. It could be said to be the crystallization of their wisdom. What did it have to do with him? However, a feeling was a feeling. Even if he could not understand it, Luo Fan could not let go of this cultivation method. At this moment, he withdrew his original plan and began to focus his mind on that cultivation method. He began to use all his methods to study this cultivation method. He wanted to exhaust all the secrets behind this cultivation method and find the source of the feeling it gave him. No matter how much Luo Fan's thoughts were suppressed, he was still an expert who could trigger the sixth tribulation. There was no need to mention how knowledgeable he was, how intelligent he was, and how strong his research ability was. As he studied it, he soon discovered what exactly it was in that cultivation method that gave him the feeling, "My fragment exists in this form?" He murmured, but his heart was filled with an inexplicable and complicated emotion. The reason why he could sense the feeling from that cultivation method was because his fragment had fused with that cultivation method in an extremely abstract way. In other words, because of the birth of the cultivation method, his fragment, which was originally scattered by this perfect world, was instinctively attracted to this cultivation method and became a certain metaphysical characteristic of this cultivation method. This kind of existence was something that Luo Fan had never encountered before. After all, it was his fragment. Even if it was split into billions and billions of pieces, and then further split into billions and billions of pieces, the fragments were extremely, extremely tiny. As a fragment of him, it was naturally an existence that had substance to it. Normally speaking, such an existence should have been transformed into some kind of existence that also had substance. But now, this fragment had actually transformed into a metaphysical characteristic of this cultivation method, an existence that could not be found at all. This was something that he had never thought of before. Because it was attached to this cultivation method, this fragment was naturally affected by this cultivation method. At this moment, although Luo Fan had already found his existence, this cultivation method was too crude, and the metaphysical characteristics were too weak. Therefore, this fragment was too small and insignificant. It was so small that it couldn't even bear Luo Fan's thoughts, to the point where he couldn't think on his own. However, even so, for Luo Fan, this was already a great surprise. Not only did finding this fragment help him understand how to gather the countless fragments in this world, but it also allowed him to understand how to finally gather the countless fragments in this world. More importantly, the existence of this fragment had opened up his mind. It allowed him to know that the existence of his fragments in other worlds was not limited to those he had been looking for before. There were more wonderful, more abstract, and more unbelievable possibilities. Just like at this moment, he had just come back to his senses. After the consciousness that existed in many perfect worlds began to change its search method, very soon, some of the worlds obtained a harvest. From all kinds of abstract phenomena, he found traces of his own will. Of course, different worlds would have completely different attacks on his fragment. Naturally, the way in which these fragments existed after they shattered was also different. For example, some were directly hidden in the phenomenon of the rotation of day and night, some were hidden in the evolution of some life, and some were hidden in the phenomenon of clouds gathering and dispersing. There were all kinds of them. In contrast, in the perfect world where the born Taoist aptitude was in the form of a human with 3 eyes and 4 elbows, the ones hidden in the cultivation method were more common and easier to deal with. As more and more fragments were sensed by him, Luo Fan's thoughts naturally began to gradually attach to the fragments he had found through the light of heaven and earth. With this change, the importance of the fragments that had not yet been attacked by the world and were still largely intact had been greatly reduced. Before he had found the fragments that had collapsed, these intact fragments were the last thing he relied on for the light of heaven and earth. If his thoughts wanted to remain intact, he needed the connection of the light of heaven and earth. In other words, he naturally needed the existence of these fragments. Under such circumstances, once these fragments were crushed by the world, what awaited him would be his own will sinking and becoming blurry. In the end, it would be devoured by the countless perfect worlds and split into billions of worlds. It was even possible that he would never have a chance to recover again. The situation now was obviously completely different. Now, he had found the collapsed fragments again. Although the existence of the fragments was completely different from what he had imagined, they were still fragments. No matter what they became, they were still a part of him. Naturally, such an existence could become the dependence of the light of heaven and earth. Naturally, it could also allow the light of heaven and earth to continue to connect the countless fragments and maintain the integrity of his thoughts. Such a change could be said to have directly moved the floating above Luo Fan's head. This finally allowed him to breathe a long sigh of relief, only to feel his mind relax. Chapter 23:14. Luo Fan clearly knew that although the encounter just now seemed peaceful, if he couldn't endure it, what awaited him would be a situation that was thousands of times more dangerous than it was now. The tribulation that was already very difficult to begin with would become even more difficult and difficult to endure under such circumstances. The probability of failing the tribulation could even be said to be 70% to 80%. This, compared to failure, was actually not much different. In contrast, now that he had found the many smaller fragments that were broken from his fragments, the probability of success had finally increased to the level it was at the beginning. Although it was still dangerous, it was still a lot stronger. It was precisely because of this that he said that he had the qualifications to continue at this time. Of course, although the importance of these fragments that had not been broken by the world had decreased a lot to him, he did not just give up and allow these fragments to be further broken by the world. Instead, he used a more proactive method, or rather, a more risky method to deal with the attack of the world. In this way, although some fragments would fail in their adventure and be further broken by the world, at the same time, it would also allow some fragments to obtain achievements that they originally did not have. In the entanglement with the world, their cultivation realm would advance layer by layer, and in the end, some fragments would even re-enter the level of tribulation realm experts. For a time, it caused the perfect heavens and the earth to surge, and it was even to the extent that the foundation of the heavens and the earth started to shake. The scene of the savage and primitive heavens and the earth that had just been born was completely minced into pieces, reconstructed, and transformed into various strange appearances of the heavens and the earth. Along with these changes, the heavens and earth fell into a strange cycle. At one moment it was the end of the world, and at another it was the birth of the world. Even the various traces left behind by the true saint that created the world that were originally hidden in the world began to appear in this process, erupting with all kinds of incredible power. It was a pity that Luo Fan's fragments were, after all, only fragments. In the face of the overall power of the perfect world, he was ultimately still inferior. Even if he could use all kinds of methods to resist the perfect world for a period of time, due to the absolute difference in power, he would still fall into the fate of the other fragments in the end. He would suffer the attack of the perfect world, be shattered, be transformed, or directly undergo some kind of transformation that was close to sublimation and disappear from the world. It could be said that the final result of these fragments' efforts was only to delay this time by a certain number of days, or perhaps a certain number of years, when the last fragment completely collapsed under the attack of perfect heaven and earth. Luo Fan sighed and turned his attention to the countless smaller fragments that he had discovered in a certain abstract state. Just as he had expected, even if all the fragments were erased by the world, he could still rely on the existence of the even finer fragments to reconnect his body. His thoughts would not be affected, and he would still be complete. In that world of 3 eyes and 4 elbows, Luo Fan's fragments, which had turned into some abstract nature of cultivation methods, had also made great progress after these days of development. At the very least, compared to the original state where he couldn't even think for himself and couldn't bear thinking, it was already countless times better. The fundamental reason for this change was none other than the fact that the being who had created this cultivation method had been continuously adjusting it over the past few days, refining it and allowing it to continuously improve. As a result, this cultivation method gradually became more intricate and profound from its original crude appearance. When Luo Fan was able to attach his thoughts to the fragments, the level of this cultivation method had actually reached the level of a normal cultivator's cultivation method before the immortal realm for the current Luo Fan, although this was still unimaginably crude, and even the cultivation method he had instinctively created was millions of times more powerful than this. It was still countless times more powerful than before. Even if it was placed in any ordinary world, it would definitely be enough to cause a bloodbath apart from this fragment, which was a certain abstract nature of the first cultivation method, because more and more living beings in this world had summarized the cultivation method. Other fragments were continuously revealed. It could be said that when every living being created their own cultivation method, the abstract nature of that cultivation method would naturally turn into a fragment of that being. Of course, because there was a huge difference between the cultivation methods that were born later and the cultivation methods that were born later, the fragments attached to the cultivation methods were naturally far inferior to the fragments attached to the first cultivation method. For example, in terms of bearing thoughts, the fragments could not do what the first cultivation method could. Through this development, Luo Fan naturally knew that if he wanted to gather all the fragments again, the only way was to fuse all the cultivation methods in this world together. Obviously, this was going to be an extremely difficult process. After all, Luo Fan could not interfere himself. He could only rely on the living beings in this world to take action on their own and fuse all the cultivation methods on their own. As for the reason, don't forget that Luo Fan's current complete thoughts were only maintained by connecting the countless discovered fragments together with the light of the world. Right now, his body, mind, and everything else had been completely divided by this disaster and turned into an unknown number of fragments. In this way, the power that he could unleash in each world could only rely on the fragments that he had just discovered and nothing else. In this way, they did not even have autonomy, so how could they fuse with each other on their own? However, although there was no way to fuse with each other on their own, it did not mean that Luo Fan could not think of a way. After all, his fragments were a certain nature of the cultivation method. Since it was a certain nature, it naturally meant that it could change the inclination of the cultivation method to a certain extent. In other words, these fragments could allow the person who cultivated this cultivation method to slightly change their original cultivation path. It would cause the cultivator to gradually feel that in order to improve this cultivation method, they would need to fuse with other cultivation methods and countless other cultivation paths to achieve this. As long as there was such a change, the cultivator would naturally replace Luo Fan to fuse with the other cultivation method. Naturally, the abstract nature of the cultivation method, Luo Fan's fragments, would be able to fuse again. This was clearly what Luo Fan had done. At this moment, the living being who had first created the first cultivation method in this world had clearly been affected by the Luo Fan's fragments hidden in this cultivation method. He had begun to believe that in order to improve this cultivation method, he needed to fuse with other cultivation method. At this moment, the situation in this world had undergone a complete change compared to the beginning. The number of living beings in this world was no longer something that could be compared to 2 or 3 kittens in the past. The number of living beings in this world had long since reached an unbelievable level. It could even be said that there was a stronghold for living beings almost every 50 kilometers. As for the vitality in the world, it had long since increased to an unimaginable level. At a glance, it was as if the entire world was covered in endless green. The first living being who had first created the cultivation method was not a cruel one. After having the idea of fusing with other cultivation methods, he did not think of forcefully snatching them. Instead, he thought of exchanging them. As a result, he began to visit the living beings one by one to communicate with them. Of course, it would be best if they exchanged cultivation method. At the very least, they would discuss Tao and understand the characteristics of each other's cultivation paths. As he went around, some living beings were naturally willing to exchange, while others were indifferent and even guarded against him like he was a thief. Because of this, the fusion of the cultivation method was not going smoothly. In the end, after more than 10,000 years, the first living being had only strengthened the original cultivation method by 100 times. Among them, the number of living beings that were willing to exchange cultivation methods with him was less than 1,000th of the living beings in this world. Evidently, this was far from satisfying the first living being. Even so, the first living being had already obtained great benefits in the process. Due to the exchange, his cultivation level had unknowingly risen to the highest level in this world. He had already reached the primordial yang level. Compared to the other living beings in this world, such a cultivation level was already more than a level stronger. What made him powerful was not just this absolute cultivation level. There was also the use of power, the control of divine abilities, and the understanding of the world. It could be said that the living beings that were originally at the same starting point as him had now become ants before him. However, the first living being did not feel much about this. Perhaps it was out of habit, or perhaps it was because he was ignorant, but he still communicated with other living beings in the original way. He still used a peaceful method to exchange cultivation methods with other living beings. This situation only fueled the arrogance of the other living beings. No matter what kind of living being it was, as long as it possessed intelligence, it would have a similar mentality. You're already so powerful, yet you still want to exchange cultivation methods with me. This proves that my cultivation method definitely has something that you desire. Perhaps after I comprehend it, I'll be able to quickly surpass you and become the strongest in this world. It was this mentality that caused the other living beings to be unwilling to exchange cultivation methods with the first living being even though they had witnessed how powerful he was. This also caused the process of the first living being gathering cultivation methods to be extremely difficult. That was the reason why he had spent 10,000 years only to obtain such a harvest. When the first living being returned to his starting point and returned to the place where he was born, he fell into a daze. Exchanging cultivation methods was clearly beneficial to both parties, so why were so many people unwilling to do so? Could it be that his comprehension was so precious that they would rather ignore the comprehension of others that were more powerful than theirs? That they would rather ignore the smoother path of cultivation? After bumping into walls for 10,000 years, the first living being finally began to feel that the current state of the world was not to his liking. This kind of dissatisfaction continued to accumulate in his heart as time passed. Finally, after hundreds of years, the first living being could no longer endure the torment in his heart. He rose up in revolt and started the first war of this world. When the war started, the first living being realized that he had done something stupid before. He was so powerful, so how could others go against his will? Why did he have to use such a peaceful method to communicate with other living beings? Wouldn't it be better to just conquer them and force them to hand over their own cultivation methods? Amidst these carefree thoughts, the war that had been started by the first living beings soon swept through the entire world. This was because it had only been tens of thousands of years since the world had been created, and the first batch of living beings had yet to fully mature. Their current realms were not very high. The strongest among them was only at the primordial unity pure yang level, like the first living being. In this way, the impact that they could cause on this world was naturally relatively small. Even though their war was so intense that it even covered the entire world and included all living beings, in the end, it did not cause much change to this world. Compared to the war between Luo Fan's fragments and the world, which often triggered the end of the world, there was a world of difference. Fortunately, this was the case, so these living beings could unleash their full potential. The characteristics of various cultivation methods were vividly displayed in this process, so that whether it was the first living being or the other living beings, as long as they did not die, they could all improve at a speed that was many times faster than before. As for the integration of cultivation methods, the process was also many times faster. Among them, the one who benefited the most was obviously the first living being. In other words, the cultivation method created by the first living being was attached to Luo Fan's fragment, which was an abstract existence. During the 10,000 years of exchange, this cultivation method had been upgraded countless times, causing the fragment to integrate with many other fragments and become at least a few hundred times stronger than before.